Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
Brian wasn't prepared for the room at the end of the hallway. The 38-year-old millionaire stood completely still, one hand resting against the doorframe as his eyes moved slowly across the small bedroom. A neatly made bed, a row of toy cars lined up across a shelf, children's books arranged with careful precision, tiny shoes placed side by side beneath a chair. For a moment, Brian thought a child must live there. The room looked loved, cared for, protected. It felt as though someone had walked out only a few minutes earlier. Yet something felt strange. The air inside the room carried a silence that was difficult to explain. A silence that didn't belong in a child's bedroom. Brian glanced over his shoulder. Lisa stood several feet away in the hallway. Just minutes earlier, she had greeted him with the same calm smile she wore every day at work. The same smile everyone knew. The same smile that never seemed to disappear. But now, it was gone. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her. For the first time since he had known her, Lisa looked as though she was carrying a weight too heavy to hide. Brian looked back into the room. Something wasn't right. Not one toy was out of place. Not one blanket was wrinkled. Not one book appeared touched. The room looked frozen, as if time had quietly stopped inside these four walls. His throat tightened. "Lisa," he said softly. She didn't answer immediately. The pause felt longer than it actually was. When she finally spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "That was my son's room." Brian felt his stomach drop. He stared at the bed again. The toy cars, the books, the little shoes. Suddenly, every detail looked different. For a second, the entire world outside that hallway seemed to disappear. The manufacturing company, the meetings, the reports, the profits. None of it mattered. Only one question remained. Where was the child? And why did this room look exactly the same, as if he had never left? The answer would change Brian forever. But before we continue, welcome back to Mr. George's Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. And if stories about real people, real struggles, and life-changing lessons mean something to you, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Your support helps this channel reach more viewers, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories that matter. Now, stay with me, because Brian thought he was simply checking on an employee who missed work. What he was about to discover inside Lisa's home would force him to question everything he believed he knew about the people around him. Brian couldn't remember how he got back to the front door. A few minutes earlier, he had stepped into Lisa's house expecting a simple explanation for a missed day of work, a family emergency, a bad case of the flu, maybe car trouble, anything ordinary, anything that made sense. Instead, he found himself standing in a home that carried a kind of heartbreak no spreadsheet could measure. Lisa walked him toward the door. Neither of them spoke much. There didn't seem to be anything appropriate to say. Some moments refused to fit inside ordinary conversations. This was one of them. As Lisa opened the door, she forced a small smile. The same smile she brought to work every morning. The same smile that greeted coworkers. The same smile that made everyone believe she was doing fine. Brian suddenly wondered how many times he had seen that smile, without ever asking what was hiding behind it. "Thank you for stopping by," Lisa said quietly. Brian nodded. "Take care of yourself." She gave another small nod. Then the door closed. Brian stood on the porch for several seconds. The cold Montana air touched his face, but he barely noticed. His mind remained trapped inside that hallway, inside that bedroom, inside a mother's grief. He slowly walked toward his truck. Every step felt heavier than the one before. The neighborhood was peaceful. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A porch light flickered across the street. Life continued as usual. Yet Brian felt as though something inside him had shifted. He climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. Silence filled the cab. His hands rested on the steering wheel. The engine wasn't running. He just sat there, For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about production targets. He wasn't thinking about payroll. He wasn't thinking about quarterly forecasts. He wasn't thinking about profits. His mind kept returning to a single image: a perfectly made bed, a row of toy cars, tiny shoes beneath a chair, a room carefully maintained for 3 years after a child was gone. Brian lowered his head. Something uncomfortable was beginning to settle inside him. Not pity, something deeper: shame. Because Lisa wasn't some distant stranger. She worked for him. She had worked for him every single day for years. He knew exactly how many vacation days she had used. He knew her attendance record. He knew her salary. He knew her employee number. He knew every detail listed inside her personnel file. Yet he never knew she spent her weekends cleaning her son's bedroom. He never knew she carried grief to work every morning. He never knew she went home each evening to a house filled with memories. The realization hit him harder than he expected. How many other people walked through the company's doors carrying burdens nobody could see? How many smiles hid pain? How many jokes covered loneliness? How many hardworking employees were fighting private battles while he sat in meetings discussing efficiency percentages? Brian leaned back against the seat. His eyes burned. For years he believed he was a good employer. He paid fair wages. He provided benefits. He rewarded strong performance. He followed the rules. But sitting there alone, none of those things felt sufficient. Because leadership wasn't only about managing work. It was about understanding people. And the truth was impossible to ignore. He barely knew the people helping him build his company. A tear rolled down his cheek. Then another. Brian quickly wiped them away, but more followed. He wasn't crying because Lisa had shared her story. He was crying because he suddenly realized how little he understood about the lives surrounding him every day. The woman everyone described as dependable, the woman who arrived early, the woman who stayed late, the woman who always smiled, had been carrying one of the heaviest losses imaginable, completely alone, and nobody knew, not even him. Have you ever looked at someone and assumed everything was okay, simply because they appeared strong? Have you ever believed a smile meant a person wasn't hurting? Most of us have. Brian certainly had. The truth is that some of the strongest people you will ever meet are carrying battles they never talk about. They show up. They do their jobs. They help others. They laugh when expected. And somehow, they keep moving forward. Meanwhile, the people around them never see the full story. Brian thought he understood his employees because he reviewed their reports. He thought attendance records and performance evaluations told him everything he needed to know. He couldn't have been more wrong. Because inside Lisa's home was a story no report could ever capture. And what happened after this visit would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. What Brian doesn't know yet is that this heartbreaking discovery is only the beginning. The friendship that follows, the lessons they teach each other, and a letter hidden away for years will transform everything. And trust me, the most emotional moment of this story hasn't happened yet. The town sat beneath a wide Montana sky, where long winters taught people patience and hard work taught them endurance. Most families in town had known each other for years. Neighbors checked on neighbors. Church gatherings filled weekends. Community events brought people together, no matter their differences. People worked hard. They looked after one another. And when difficult times arrived, as they often did, they carried those burdens together. At the edge of town stood one of the largest employers in the area, a manufacturing company that had grown steadily over the past decade. Its products traveled across the country. Its reputation continued expanding. Its profits climbed year after year. At the center of that success stood Brian. Most people considered him a local success story. Some admired him. Others envied him. Many respected him. Few actually knew him. At 38 years old, Brian had built something most people only talked about. He started with almost nothing. No wealthy family. No special advantages. No shortcuts. Just long hours, stubborn determination, and an unwillingness to quit when others would have given up. The company represented years of sacrifice, Years of risk. Years of sleeping less than he should have. Years of choosing work over nearly everything else. Those sacrifices paid off financially. The business flourished. Brian became wealthy, very wealthy. Yet success had quietly changed him. Not in the way people assumed. Money hadn't made him arrogant. Money hadn't made him cruel. The change happened gradually. So gradually, he barely noticed it himself. The company became numbers. Then the numbers became priorities. Then the priorities became his entire world. Most mornings followed the same routine. Brian arrived before sunrise. The parking lot was usually empty when his truck rolled into its reserved space. He liked arriving before everyone else. The silence helped him think, or at least that's what he told himself. He walked through the front entrance, carrying coffee and a tablet filled with reports waiting for review. Production numbers, inventory numbers, shipping numbers, attendance numbers, profit numbers, forecast numbers. His day often started with numbers and ended the same way. The routine rarely changed. He entered his office, turned on the lights, placed his coffee beside the desk, opened reports, reviewed performance, identified problems, solved problems, moved on to the next problem. Every decision felt important. Every hour felt scheduled. Every minute seemed assigned to a task. His calendar remained packed weeks in advance. Meetings, reviews, planning sessions, budget discussions, vendor calls, expansion opportunities. The company continued growing because Brian never stopped pushing it forward. Employees often joked that Brian probably worked while sleeping. The joke wasn't far from reality. One morning looked almost identical to hundreds before it. Brian sat behind his desk reviewing department performance reports. His attention moved quickly across the screen. Efficiency percentages, output goals, staffing metrics, shipping deadlines. Everything organized, everything measurable, everything clear. Numbers made sense. Numbers didn't hide anything. Numbers didn't lie. Or so Brian believed. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. He glanced toward the office door. A staff member delivered several updated reports. Brian thanked them. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Once the door closed, his attention returned immediately to the paperwork. Hours passed. The company slowly came to life outside his office. Machines started running. Employees arrived. Departments settled into their routines. Conversations filled hallways. Phones rang. Work continued. Brian remained inside his office, focused, productive, disconnected, not intentionally, simply out of habit. He knew nearly every employee by name. At least he believed he did. But knowing a name and knowing a person were entirely different things. That distinction had become blurry somewhere along the way. At lunch, Brian remained at his desk. Again. The cafeteria sat only a short walk away. Employees gathered there daily. Conversations happened. Friendships developed. Stories were shared. Brian rarely joined them. There was always another report waiting. Always another task demanding attention. Always another reason to stay inside his office. The truth was simpler. Work had become easier than connection. Numbers felt predictable. People didn't. Over the years, that habit built invisible walls around his life. The company grew larger. His personal world grew smaller. Most evenings ended similarly. The office emptied. Employees returned home to families, friends, children, dinner tables, weekend plans. Meanwhile, Brian remained behind, reviewing another report, answering another email, preparing for another meeting. He told himself it was necessary. Perhaps some of it was, but not all of it. Sometimes work simply gave him an excuse to avoid noticing how quiet his personal life had become. His house was large, beautiful, expensive, and often silent. No spouse waiting. No children running through hallways. No family dinners. No one asking about his day. Years earlier, he imagined success would eventually create happiness. Instead, happiness kept moving farther ahead. Always attached, to the next goal, the next achievement, the next milestone. He rarely stopped long enough to question it. One person consistently appeared in his reports. Lisa, administrative coordinator. Reliable, efficient, professional. Those words appeared often when managers evaluated her performance. Brian appreciated employees like Lisa, people who solved problems before they became problems, people who required little supervision, people who kept things running smoothly. From Brian's perspective, Lisa represented exactly what every employer hoped to find: dependable, organized, consistent. If paperwork needed attention, Lisa handled it. If schedules became complicated, Lisa figured them out. If communication problems appeared between departments, Lisa usually solved them before anyone escalated concerns. Managers praised her regularly. Co-workers respected her. Brian noticed, but only professionally. He knew her work, nothing more. Occasionally he passed her in hallways. She always smiled, always greeted people kindly, always seemed composed. Brian appreciated that. The workplace needed people who maintained positive attitudes, especially during stressful periods. Whenever her name appeared in reports, there was rarely anything negative attached to it. No disciplinary concerns, no attendance issues, no performance concerns, just consistency. Month after month, year after year. Reliable, dependable, professional. In Brian's mind, that was Lisa, a valuable employee, an important contributor, one of many people helping the company succeed. Nothing about those reports suggested anything unusual. Nothing suggested hidden struggles. Nothing suggested grief. Nothing suggested pain. Because reports only captured measurable facts. They never captured human stories. And Brian had spent so many years studying reports that he no longer noticed what they failed to reveal. Late Friday afternoon, Brian reviewed staffing records before ending the week. Everything appeared normal. Departments fully staffed. Schedules confirmed. Attendance stable. The following Monday promised another productive week. He shut down his computer, collected his belongings, returned home. The weekend passed quickly. Monday morning arrived. Brian entered the office before sunrise. Coffee, reports, routine. The same pattern continued. As employees arrived, the company slowly filled with activity. Brian opened attendance records, a task so ordinary he barely thought about it. His eyes moved automatically across names. Present, 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 present. Then he stopped. His attention returned to one line. He read it again, then once more. A small crease formed between his eyebrows. For the first time in nearly 2 years, something unusual appeared beside Lisa's name. Absent. Brian stared at the screen for a moment. Not because the absence itself seemed alarming. Employees missed work sometimes. Life happened. Illness happened. Emergencies happened. That was normal. What wasn't normal was seeing Lisa's name beside that word. Absent. For the first time in years, Brian leaned back slightly. His eyes remained fixed on the attendance report. A strange feeling settled in the back of his mind. Small, barely noticeable, yet impossible to ignore. Lisa wasn't at work, and somehow that felt different. Brian continued staring at the attendance report for several seconds before finally moving on. Absent. The word remained surprisingly noticeable. Not because missing work was unusual. Every company dealt with absences. People got sick. Cars broke down. Family emergencies happened. Life rarely followed schedules. Still, seeing Lisa's name attached to that word felt out of place, like finding a typo inside a document that had always been flawless. He closed the report and shifted his attention to the rest of the morning's tasks. Production updates, department schedules, inventory reviews. The same responsibilities that occupied every Monday. The same responsibilities that usually held his complete focus. Yet several minutes later, he found himself opening the attendance report again. His eyes returned to the same line. Lisa, absent. Brian frowned slightly, then closed the report once more. Outside his office, the workday continued gathering momentum. Phones rang. Departments settled into their routines. Employees moved through hallways carrying paperwork and coffee cups. The company operated exactly as it always did, at least on the surface. By mid-morning, small conversations had already begun. Nothing dramatic, just curiosity, the kind that naturally appears when someone dependable suddenly isn't there. Lisa's desk sat near an area where employees frequently passed throughout the day. People noticed immediately. The empty chair, the computer screen that remained dark, the untouched workspace. A place usually filled with activity now sat unusually quiet. Several employees slowed as they walked past. Some glanced toward the desk. Others looked around as though expecting Lisa to appear at any moment. But she never did. A few wondered aloud if she was sick. Others guessed she might have taken a personal day. Nobody seemed overly concerned yet, just surprised. After all, Lisa was known for showing up. Rain, snow, long Montana winters, busy seasons, difficult days. None of it usually kept her away. Around 10 o'clock, Brian left his office to visit another department. As he passed through the administrative area, his attention shifted toward Lisa's workspace. The desk looked exactly as employees described. Organized, neat, waiting. He slowed his pace without realizing it. For a moment he stood looking at the empty chair. Everything appeared perfectly arranged. Documents stacked neatly, office supplies organized. A calendar still open to the current week. It looked less like someone was absent and more like someone had stepped away for a few minutes. Brian continued walking. Still, the image stayed with him. Later that morning, he overheard a brief conversation between employees. "Have you heard from Lisa?" "No." "That's strange." "Yeah." She usually answers right away. The discussion lasted only moments. Yet Brian noticed something. Nobody sounded annoyed. Nobody complained about extra work. Nobody criticized her absence. Instead, there was genuine concern. The realization caught his attention. People clearly cared about her. That wasn't something performance reports measured. Near lunchtime, Brian returned to his office. He opened several emails, reviewed financial summaries, answered messages, tried focusing. Then his office phone rang. He answered immediately. A brief discussion regarding scheduling adjustments followed. One department needed information that Lisa normally handled. Another employee was attempting to locate certain files. Small issues, nothing serious. Yet each conversation reminded Brian of the same thing. Lisa wasn't there. For years, her work had been so efficient that many people barely noticed how much she actually handled. Now they were noticing. Because her absence left small gaps throughout the day. Not major problems. Just enough disruption to reveal how important she had become. Around noon, Brian glanced through company communications. No message from Lisa. No explanation. No request for leave. Nothing. That wasn't like her. His concern increased slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel unusual. He reached for his phone. Found Lisa's contact information. Pressed call. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Eventually, voicemail answered. Brian hesitated, then left a short message. "Hi, Lisa. It's Brian, just checking in. Give us a call when you can." Simple. Professional. Nothing more. He ended the call and returned to work, or tried to. 30 minutes later, he checked his phone. No response. An hour later, still nothing. By early afternoon, more employees had begun asking questions. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had heard from her. Several coworkers attempted calling. No answer. One sent a text. No reply. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. The difference was subtle, but noticeable. People stopped asking where she was. They started asking if she was okay. Brian remained inside his office, reviewing reports. At least, that was what he appeared to be doing. The truth was different. His concentration kept breaking. Paragraphs blurred together. Numbers required multiple readings. Tasks that normally took minutes stretched longer than they should have. Several times he reached for his phone without thinking. Each time, no missed calls appeared. No messages. No updates. He set the phone down. Picked it up again 10 minutes later. Then again. The behavior irritated him. Brian wasn't usually distracted, especially not over a single absence. Yet the feeling refused to disappear. As afternoon settled over the town, snowflakes began drifting outside. Nothing unusual for Montana. Employees occasionally paused near windows to watch the weather. Inside the building, work continued. Yet an uncomfortable question lingered beneath everyday conversations. Where was Lisa? By 3 o'clock, Brian called again. This time, the phone went directly to voicemail. He listened briefly, then ended the call. Something tightened inside his chest. Not panic, not fear, just uncertainty. And uncertainty had never been his favorite thing. He preferred facts. Facts provided direction. Facts created solutions. Right now, facts were missing. A knock interrupted his thoughts. An employee stepped into the office carrying paperwork. Brian reviewed the documents, signed what needed signing, held a short conversation. The employee thanked him and left. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 minutes. The moment the door closed, Brian checked his phone again. Still nothing. He stared at the screen, then shook his head at himself. This was becoming ridiculous. Employees missed work. That happened. Perhaps Lisa simply needed time away. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Perhaps she was resting. There were countless reasonable explanations. Yet his instincts refused to settle. The afternoon stretched forward. Work continued. The clock moved steadily toward closing time. One by one, employees began finishing their shifts. Conversations shifted toward evening plans. People gathered belongings. Departments gradually quieted. As the office emptied, Lisa's desk remained untouched. The sight bothered Brian more than he expected. He stood near the administrative area after most employees had gone home. The building felt different now, quieter, almost too quiet. His gaze settled once more on the empty chair. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Months earlier, he had walked past this same desk during a particularly stressful week. Several departments were dealing with scheduling problems. Tension filled the office. People were frustrated. Deadlines were approaching. Lisa had somehow managed to calm everyone down. Not through authority, not through demands. Simply through patience and humor. Within an hour, the situation improved. Brian remembered being impressed. At the time, he viewed it as strong workplace performance. Standing there now, he realized it was more than that. People trusted her. That mattered. He looked down at his phone again. Still nothing. The silence had lasted all day. At some point, concern became impossible to ignore. Brian returned to his office, sat down, looked through the window overlooking part of the parking lot. Most vehicles were already gone. The building would soon close for the evening. He thought about going home, continuing tomorrow, waiting another day. That would probably be the normal approach, the professional approach. Yet something stopped him. Lisa had worked for him for years. She had never disappeared without explanation. Never. Not once. And every attempt to reach her had failed. Brian stared out the window, then reached for his keys. The decision came quietly, without drama, without overthinking. He would drive to her house himself, not as a millionaire, not as the owner of the company, simply as someone trying to make sure another person was okay. Brian stood, picked up his coat, turned off the lights in his office, and for the first time that day, he felt certain about what he needed to do next. He was going to find Lisa. Brian stepped out of the building and locked the front entrance behind him. The evening air carried the familiar chill that settled over Montana during much of the year. The parking lot was nearly empty now. Most employees had already gone home. A few distant headlights moved along the main road beyond the industrial area. For a moment, Brian stood beside his truck, looking back at the company he had spent years building. The building represented countless sacrifices, countless late nights, countless risks. There had been a time when simply keeping the doors open felt like a victory. Now the company employed dozens of people and supported families throughout the town. By most standards, Brian had achieved everything he once wanted. Yet as he unlocked his truck and climbed inside, his thoughts weren't focused on success. They kept returning to the same unanswered question. Where was Lisa? He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The manufacturing district slowly disappeared behind him as he headed toward the residential side of town. Streetlights flickered on one by one as daylight faded. The sky stretched wide above the landscape, painted with the last traces of evening. Brian drove in silence. No radio, no phone calls, no distractions. Just the sound of the road beneath the tires. Normally, his drive home lasted barely 10 minutes. Normally, he spent the drive thinking about work. Problems that needed solving. Goals that needed reaching. Meetings scheduled for the next day. Tonight felt different. His thoughts drifted somewhere they rarely went. Toward the people who worked for him. Not departments. Not job titles. People. The realization made him uncomfortable, because despite owning the company, he knew surprisingly little about many of them. He knew who consistently exceeded expectations. He knew who arrived late. He knew who requested vacation time. He knew who qualified for promotions. He knew the information contained inside files and reports. But how much did he actually know? The question lingered. A red traffic light forced him to stop near the center of town. Several restaurants were beginning to fill with customers. Families entered carrying coats and scarves. Friends laughed together on sidewalks. Couples crossed the street holding hands. Brian watched them while waiting for the light to change. He suddenly realized how often he drove through town without really seeing it, without noticing the lives unfolding around him, without paying attention. Work had a way of narrowing his focus. The company occupied so much of his attention that everything else often faded into the background. The light turned green. He continued driving. As the streets gradually became quieter, the houses changed. The neighborhoods near Brian's home featured larger properties, wide driveways, new construction, landscaped yards. The homes reflected financial comfort. This part of town looked different. The houses were smaller, older, closer together. Many had porches decorated with seasonal lights. Some displayed children's bicycles near front steps. Others had vehicles parked along the street. There was nothing impressive about the neighborhood from a financial perspective. Yet there was something welcoming about it. Something genuine. People seemed connected. Several neighbors stood outside talking despite the cold weather. Others carried groceries inside. A few children played beneath the watchful eyes of parents standing nearby. Brian slowed as he drove deeper into the neighborhood. He realized he had never visited this area before, not because he avoided it. There had simply never been a reason. Most of his life followed a narrow routine. Home, office, business meetings, repeat. Entire sections of town existed beyond that routine. Entire communities, entire stories. The thought stayed with him as he turned onto the street, listed in Lisa's employee records. A row of modest houses lined both sides of the road. Warm lights glowed through windows. The neighborhood felt peaceful, comfortable, lived in. Brian checked the address again, then spotted the house. Simple, well-maintained. Nothing flashy, nothing neglected. Just a small home cared for with obvious pride. He parked along the curb and sat quietly for a moment. The porch light illuminated the front entrance. A small flower arrangement sat near the steps despite the season. The yard was tidy, the windows clean. Everything looked orderly, normal. Yet Lisa still wasn't answering calls. Brian switched off the engine. For a second, uncertainty returned. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he was crossing a line. Perhaps she simply wanted privacy. Perhaps she would feel uncomfortable seeing her boss at her front door. He considered leaving, then remembered the unanswered calls, the missed workday, the complete silence. No, he needed to know she was okay. Brian stepped out of the truck and walked toward the house. The wooden steps creaked softly beneath his shoes. He reached the front door, paused, then knocked. The sound echoed through the house. No response. Brian waited. A few seconds passed. Then he knocked again. This time he heard movement inside. Slow movement, footsteps approaching. The lock turned. The door opened. Lisa stood in front of him. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. "Gosh," she said softly. "Brian?" Brian immediately noticed she looked different. Not dramatically different. Just tired. Very tired. The kind of exhaustion that sleep alone couldn't fix. The smile she usually wore appeared smaller than usual. Her eyes carried traces of a difficult day. Yet despite all of that, her first reaction wasn't irritation. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't even confusion. It was concern about work. "I'm so sorry," she said almost immediately. Brian blinked. "What?" She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I should have called. I know I should have called." Even now, standing at her own front door after disappearing for an entire day, Lisa seemed more worried about inconveniencing other people than explaining herself. Brian found that surprising. "It's okay," he said. "We were just worried." The statement seemed to catch her off guard. For a second, she simply looked at him. Then her expression softened. "Worried? Nobody could reach you." Lisa glanced downward. A flicker of guilt crossed her face. "My phone died this morning." Brian nodded. That explained part of it, but not everything. Something still felt off. Not suspicious, not alarming, just different. Lisa hesitated, then stepped aside. "You probably didn't come all the way here to stand on the porch." Brian smiled politely. "No, probably not. Would you like to come in?" He paused briefly before nodding. "Sure." Lisa opened the door wider. Brian stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was warmth. Not the temperature, the feeling. The house immediately felt welcoming, comfortable, lived in. Nothing about it appeared expensive. The furniture was simple, the decorations modest, yet everything reflected care, the kind of care that can't be purchased. Family photographs rested on shelves. Books occupied small spaces throughout the room. Soft lighting created a peaceful atmosphere. Brian removed his coat. Lisa offered to hang it near the entrance. He thanked her. "Can I get you some tea?" she asked. "You don't have to." "I know." The faint smile that followed looked more familiar, closer to the Lisa everyone knew. "Tea would be nice." "Good." She motioned toward the living room. "Have a seat." Brian settled into a chair while Lisa disappeared briefly into the kitchen. From where he sat, he could see portions of the house extending beyond the main living area. Everything appeared remarkably organized. Not sterile. Not overly perfect. Simply cared for. The room carried evidence of someone who paid attention to details. A folded blanket placed neatly across the couch. Fresh flowers arranged near a window. Books organized on shelves. Small decorative items positioned thoughtfully. Nothing extravagant. Everything intentional. The longer Brian sat there, the more he found himself looking around. Not judging. Observing. Trying to understand the person who spent years working only a few hundred feet from his office. He heard cabinet doors opening in the kitchen. The sound of water running. The quiet rhythm of someone preparing tea. Meanwhile, his gaze wandered toward the hallway extending from the living room. Several framed photographs decorated the wall. Family. Moments. Celebrations. Memories. Again, he realized how little he actually knew. Years of employment. Years of conversations limited almost entirely to work. Yet sitting inside her home felt like meeting a different version of Lisa. A more complete version. His eyes continued down the hallway. Then something caught his attention. One of the doors stood slightly open, just enough to reveal a small portion of the room beyond. Brian couldn't see much. Only a glimpse. A corner. Part of a wall. A hint of bright color inside. Nothing more. Yet something about the room immediately drew his attention. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps because it looked different from the rest of the house. Perhaps because it seemed untouched. Perhaps because the partially open door felt strangely deliberate. Brian continued looking toward it. A quiet curiosity forming. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled his attention away momentarily. Lisa was returning with the tea. But as Brian glanced once more toward the hallway, his eyes settled again on the partially opened door. and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he found himself wondering what was inside. Lisa stepped into the living room carrying 2 steaming mugs. The smell of tea drifted through the house. Brian thanked her as she carefully placed one of the mugs on the coffee table. "Hopefully it's okay," Lisa said. "It's perfect." She settled into a chair across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural. The kind of quiet that sometimes appears between 2 people trying to find the right place to begin a conversation. Brian wrapped both hands around the warm mug. His eyes drifted toward the hallway again. The partially opened door remained exactly where it had been moments earlier. A narrow opening, just enough to reveal a glimpse of the room beyond. Lisa noticed. He could tell she noticed. Her eyes briefly followed his gaze before returning to her tea. Neither mentioned it. At least, not immediately. Brian tried focusing on the conversation. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Lisa offered a small smile. "A little better. You don't look like you've gotten much rest." A quiet laugh escaped her. "That's probably because I haven't." The honesty surprised him. At work, Lisa usually deflected concern with humor. Tonight, she seemed too tired for that. For several seconds, she stared into her mug. The expression on her face suggested her thoughts were somewhere far away. Brian found himself looking toward the hallway once more. The room continued pulling at his attention, not because of curiosity alone. There was something strangely emotional about it, something difficult to explain. The rest of the house felt lived in, used, active. That room felt different, still, preserved, almost protected. Eventually Brian spoke. "What room is that?" The question came out softer than he intended. Lisa didn't answer immediately. The reaction was subtle. A slight pause, a tightening around her eyes, a small shift in posture. Nothing dramatic. Yet it changed the atmosphere instantly. The warmth that had filled the conversation seemed to retreat. Not completely, just enough for Brian to notice. For the first time since arriving, Lisa looked uncertain. Her gaze moved toward the hallway, toward the same door, toward the same room. The silence stretched. Brian immediately regretted asking. "Sorry," he said. "You don't have to answer." "No." Her voice was gentle. "It's okay." Another pause followed. Lisa lowered her eyes to her tea. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. Brian noticed she wasn't drinking it. She simply held it, as though the warmth offered comfort. The room remained quiet. The ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house became suddenly noticeable. Finally, Lisa stood. The movement caught Brian off guard. She placed her mug on the table. For several seconds, she remained standing beside her chair, thinking, deciding. Brian stayed silent. Instinct told him not to rush the moment, not to fill the silence, not to push. Lisa slowly turned toward the hallway, then looked back at him. "Come with me." The words were barely above a whisper. Brian set his mug down and stood. His heartbeat felt strangely heavier. Neither spoke as they walked toward the hallway. The framed photographs lining the wall seemed more noticeable now. Family gatherings, celebrations, smiling faces, pieces of a life. The farther they walked, the quieter the house seemed to become. Lisa reached the door. For a moment, she rested her hand against it, not opening it immediately, just standing there. Brian remained several steps behind. Something about the moment felt deeply personal, as though he had reached a place few people ever entered. Finally, Lisa pushed the door open. Brian looked inside and stopped. The room was beautiful, small, simple, yet cared for in a way that immediately captured attention. A neatly made bed sat against one wall. The blankets were perfectly arranged, not a wrinkle anywhere. The pillows looked freshly positioned. Everything appeared ready for bedtime, as though someone might walk in later and climb beneath the covers. Brian's eyes moved slowly through the room. A bookshelf stood nearby. Children's books filled every shelf, each one carefully organized. Some appeared worn from use. Others looked nearly untouched. None were dusty. None looked forgotten. The room felt maintained, actively maintained. On another shelf sat several toy cars, lined up with remarkable precision, each one facing the same direction, each one positioned carefully beside the next. The arrangement looked intentional, thoughtful, loved. A small desk occupied one corner. School supplies remained neatly organized. Pencils, markers, notebooks, everything exactly where it belonged. Nothing scattered, nothing neglected. Brian glanced toward the closet. The door stood partially open. Inside hung small clothes, clean, pressed, organized. The sight immediately created a knot in his chest. There was something deeply emotional about seeing those clothes still hanging there, waiting. Not because he understood why, because he didn't. Not yet. The room carried a strange feeling. Not sadness, not exactly. Something more complicated. A mixture of love and loss, existing in the same space. Every object seemed to tell the same story. Someone mattered here. Someone was cherished here. Someone was remembered here. The realization settled over Brian slowly. He looked back at the bed. The books, the toys, the clothes. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked forgotten. Everything looked preserved, protected from time itself. For several moments, neither spoke. Brian sensed this wasn't a room visitors normally entered. This wasn't simply another room in the house. It was something more, something sacred. Lisa stepped forward. Her hand gently brushed across the top of the dresser. The movement looked familiar, practiced, as though she had done it hundreds of times before, maybe thousands. Brian watched her quietly. She moved toward the bookshelf, straightened a book that didn't actually need straightening, adjusted one of the toy cars by less than an inch. The actions seemed automatic, almost unconscious, yet they revealed something important. This room wasn't being left alone. Someone was caring for it regularly. The thought lingered. Brian studied the fresh sheets on the bed, the clean surfaces, the careful organization, the complete absence of dust. The room looked less like a memory, and more like a responsibility being lovingly maintained. His throat tightened. A question formed inside his mind. A question he was suddenly afraid to ask. Because deep down, he already suspected the answer wouldn't be easy. He looked toward Lisa. She stood beside the bookshelf now, her eyes moving across the room. Not as a visitor, not as someone remembering, as someone still connected to every object inside it. The expression on her face carried an emotion Brian couldn't fully describe. Love, heartache, devotion, all existing together. For a long moment, she said nothing. Neither did he. Then she slowly exhaled. The sound felt heavy, as though it carried years within it. When she finally looked at Brian, her eyes glistened. Not dramatically, just enough for him to understand how difficult this moment was becoming. The silence returned, longer this time, more meaningful. And then Lisa spoke, not to answer the question directly, not yet, but to prepare herself for it. To gather the strength required to say words she clearly didn't speak often. Her voice was quiet, careful, fragile. I've never told anyone at work about this. Brian remained completely still. Lisa looked around the room one more time, at the bed, at the books, at the toy cars, at the life preserved inside these walls. Then she drew a slow breath and prepared to tell him the truth. For several seconds, neither Brian nor Lisa spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath with them. Lisa stood beside the bookshelf, her fingertips resting lightly against one of the children's books. Not gripping it, not opening it, just touching it, as though the contact itself mattered. Brian remained where he was. He sensed that this wasn't a moment for questions. This wasn't a moment for advice. It wasn't a moment for reassurance. So he simply listened. Lisa's eyes moved across the room. The bed, the dresser, the toy cars, the small clothes hanging inside the closet. Each glance carried familiarity. Each glance carried history. Finally, she spoke. He was 6. The words landed softly. yet they seemed to echo through the room. Brian felt his chest tighten. Lisa lowered her eyes. A small smile appeared briefly. The kind of smile people wear when remembering someone they love. He loved those cars. Her gaze shifted toward the shelf. He used to line them up every night before bed. Brian looked at the collection again. Suddenly, they no longer looked like toys. They looked like memories. He said they needed to be ready for the morning. A quiet laugh escaped her. For a moment, warmth touched her expression. Then it faded. The silence returned. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just honest. Lisa slowly crossed the room. Her movements were careful, familiar. She stopped beside the bed. Her hand brushed across the blanket. A simple gesture. Yet Brian sensed it carried years of emotion. He got sick when he was 3. The sentence came without warning. Brian felt his stomach drop. Lisa continued looking at the bed. Not at Brian. Not at the floor. At the bed. As though the memories lived there. The doctors thought they knew what it was at first. She swallowed, then continued. But they were wrong. Her voice remained steady, remarkably steady. Not because the pain was gone, because she had carried it for so long. There weren't many cases. She paused, searching for words. The specialists kept trying different treatments. Brian said nothing. Lisa didn't need interruptions. She didn't need sympathy disguised as conversation. She needed space, so he gave it to her. We spent a lot of time in hospitals. Her eyes drifted toward the window. I learned how to sleep in uncomfortable chairs. A faint smile appeared. I learned which vending machines worked, and which ones stole your money. The smile disappeared again. I learned medical words I never wanted to know. Brian listened. Every sentence felt real. Not rehearsed, not polished, just pieces of a life being shared. He was brave. The statement came immediately, without hesitation, without thought, as though there was no question about it. He was always the one making other people feel better. Lisa laughed softly through her nose. The nurses loved him. Her fingers moved across the blanket again. He'd tell jokes when he could barely keep his eyes open. Brian looked down. The image hurt. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt human. A child trying to make adults smile while fighting something impossible. Lisa grew quiet. The room settled around them once more. When she spoke again, her voice became softer. The last year was the hardest. Brian remained silent. He kept asking when he could come home. The words almost broke apart before reaching the end. Lisa looked away quickly, not hiding emotion, trying to contain it. For a moment she stared toward the bookshelf, then toward the toy cars, then back to the bed, as though moving her eyes helped her continue. I kept telling him soon. A pause. Even when I wasn't sure. Another pause. I just didn't want him to be afraid. Brian felt his throat tighten. Still he said nothing. Lisa deserved uninterrupted space. The room deserved silence. Some stories lose their power when people rush to fill the empty spaces. This wasn't one of those moments. Several seconds passed. Then Lisa sat carefully on the edge of the bed. The mattress barely shifted. The movement looked familiar, like a routine repeated countless times. Her hand rested against the blanket. A simple gesture. Yet Brian noticed something. The spot where her hand rested wasn't random. It was the exact place where someone small might have slept. The realization hit him unexpectedly. Lisa looked down. He passed away 3 years ago. There it was, the truth. Simple, direct, no dramatic build-up, no attempt to soften it. Just reality. 3 years. Brian's eyes moved around the room again. Everything suddenly carried greater meaning. The fresh sheets, the organized shelves, the carefully arranged toys. Nothing here existed by accident. Everything represented love. Everything represented remembrance. Everything represented a mother refusing to let precious memories disappear. Lisa stood again. She moved toward the dresser, opened the top drawer. Inside sat neatly folded clothes. Brian noticed the way she touched them, carefully, almost reverently. She lifted a small shirt, held it for a moment, then folded it again, exactly as it had been before. Not because it needed folding, because the action mattered, because the ritual mattered, because grief often hides inside ordinary habits. I wash these every few months. Brian looked at her. Lisa kept her attention on the drawer. I know that probably sounds strange. Brian didn't answer. Not because he agreed. Not because he disagreed. Because he understood she wasn't asking for judgment. She was simply telling the truth. She closed the drawer, then adjusted a picture frame sitting on top of the dresser. The frame was already straight, yet she straightened it anyway. A small action, another ritual, another habit, another expression of love. I clean the room every week. Her voice remained calm. I dust everything. She glanced toward the shelves. I organize the books. Toward the toy cars. I make the bed. Toward the closet. I check the clothes. Brian listened. Every sentence revealed something important. Not through explanations, through actions. Lisa wasn't describing grief. She was living it, right there in front of him. Every careful movement told the story. Every routine, every habit, every object. She slowly walked toward the bookshelf. One of the toy cars sat slightly forward compared to the others. She gently pushed it back into line. The adjustment couldn't have been more than an inch. Yet she noticed it immediately. Brian felt something shift inside him. Until this moment, grief had always been something abstract, a concept, an event people survived. Now he was seeing what it looked like years later. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet, persistent, hidden inside ordinary moments, hidden inside routines, hidden inside habits nobody else noticed. Lisa's eyes remained on the shelf. For a long time, I thought I'd eventually change the room. She smiled faintly. People kept telling me I would. Her fingers traced the edge of a book. They meant well. A small pause. They really did. Brian could hear it in her voice. There was no anger, no resentment, just understanding. But every time I tried, her sentence faded. She looked around the room, at everything. The bed, the books, the toys, the memories. Then she shook her head. I couldn't. The room fell silent again. Longer this time. Brian watched her. Watched the woman everyone at work believed they knew. The dependable employee. The calm coworker. The person who always smiled. Yet nobody knew this version. Nobody knew about the room. Nobody knew about the routines. Nobody knew about the years spent carrying loss behind quiet professionalism. Not even him. Especially not him. Lisa slowly sat back down on the edge of the bed. Her eyes never left the room. I don't keep it this way, because I think he's coming back. The statement was immediate. Certain. Important. Brian could tell she'd thought about those words many times. She drew a slow breath, then continued. I know he's gone. The sentence hung in the air. Painful. Honest. Final. Several seconds passed. Then she looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice became almost a whisper. But if this room disappears, a pause, longer than the others, if it all disappears. Her eyes closed briefly, just for a moment. When they opened again, they glistened. Not with fresh grief, with enduring grief. The kind that learns how to live quietly beside you. Her voice trembled for the first time, only slightly. Sometimes it feels like I'd be losing him all over again. The room became completely still. Brian didn't move, didn't speak, didn't interrupt. There was nothing he could possibly say, no advice, no solution, no words capable of carrying the weight of that truth. So he simply listened. And when Lisa finally lowered her gaze, and the room settled into silence once more, Brian remained exactly where he was, quiet, present, listening. The silence said everything that words could not. The silence remained between them for several long moments. Not an uncomfortable silence. Not the kind people rush to fill. This silence felt necessary. Lisa sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Brian remained standing a few feet away. Neither seemed eager to break the moment. The room itself seemed to hold the conversation now. The neatly made bed, the books, the toy cars, the carefully folded clothes. Everything spoke without words. Brian looked around one final time, not out of curiosity anymore, out of understanding, or at least the beginning of understanding. He knew there was still far more he didn't know, far more he couldn't possibly understand. But something had changed. The room was no longer simply a room. It was evidence. Evidence of love that hadn't disappeared. Evidence of a mother who refused to let memory fade. Evidence of pain carried quietly for years. Brian slowly exhaled. Lisa looked toward him. Her expression remained calm, tired, honest, the way people look after finally setting down a burden they've carried alone for too long. Neither of them smiled. Neither needed to. The moment wasn't sad in the way Brian expected. There was sadness, certainly, but there was also strength. The kind of strength most people never notice. The kind that shows up every morning. The kind that goes to work. The kind that keeps moving forward. The kind that smiles even when life has delivered unimaginable loss. Brian found himself respecting Lisa in a completely different way. Not because she had survived something difficult, because she continued living with grace afterward. Many people would have collapsed beneath that weight. Lisa had somehow continued helping others while carrying it. That realization stayed with him. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Thank you for telling me." The words felt inadequate, too small, yet they were honest. Lisa nodded. A faint smile touched her face. Not the professional smile she wore at work. Something more genuine, more vulnerable. "I don't usually talk about it." Brian believed her. He could tell this wasn't a story she shared often. Perhaps not at all. The room felt quiet again. After another minute, Lisa stood. Together they walked back toward the living room. Neither felt the need to force conversation. The house seemed different now, not because it had changed, because Brian had changed. He noticed things differently. The photographs along the hallway, the care throughout the home, the warmth that filled every room. The details carried meaning now. When they reached the living room, their tea sat exactly where they had left it. Both mugs had gone cold. Neither mentioned it. Lisa gave a small laugh. "I guess we got distracted." Brian smiled softly. "Just a little?" The brief moment of humor eased some of the heaviness. Not enough to erase it, just enough to remind them that life contained more than grief. For several minutes, they spoke quietly. Simple conversation, nothing profound, nothing dramatic. The kind of conversation people have when emotions have already said the important things. Eventually, Brian glanced toward the window. Night had fully settled over the town. He realized how long he had been there. Longer than intended. Longer than either of them expected. He slowly stood. "I should probably let you rest." Lisa nodded. "You're probably right." She walked him toward the front door. The same door she had opened earlier. Only now, everything felt different. Brian paused before leaving. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. How do you leave after a conversation like that? How do you summarize years of grief in a single sentence? You don't. So he chose honesty. "If you need anything." The sentence stopped halfway because he realized he didn't know how to finish it. Lisa noticed. A faint smile appeared. "Thank you." Simple. Sincere. "Enough." Brian nodded, then stepped outside. The cold air greeted him immediately. He pulled his coat tighter as he walked toward the truck. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Several houses glowed softly beneath porch lights. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted through the evening air. A television flickered behind a nearby window. Life continued. Ordinary. Unaware. Brian reached the driver's door, opened it, climbed inside, then closed it behind him. Silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that feels louder than noise. For several seconds, he simply sat there. His hands rested against the steering wheel. The engine remained off. The dashboard dark. The house stood visible through the windshield. Brian stared at it, his thoughts moving in directions they rarely traveled. The room replayed itself inside his mind. The bed, the books, the toy cars, the folded clothes, the routines, the rituals, the love, everything connected to a reality he had never considered. For years, Lisa worked only a short walk from his office. For years, yet he had no idea, not even a clue. He leaned back in his seat. A difficult realization settled over him. The version of Lisa he knew wasn't actually Lisa. It was a collection of workplace observations, attendance records, performance reviews, schedules, reports, metrics. That wasn't a person. That was data. Useful data. Important data. But still incomplete. Painfully incomplete. Brian stared through the windshield. The realization expanded. If he knew so little about Lisa, how little did he know about everyone else? The question hit harder than expected. He thought about the people who arrived every morning. The people who helped build the company. The people whose work contributed to every success he celebrated. What did he really know about them? Not job titles. Not productivity numbers. Not performance ratings. People. Their lives. Their struggles. Their victories. Their fears. Their families. Their dreams. Their losses. The uncomfortable answer arrived quickly. Very little. The truth sat heavily in his chest. For years, Brian believed he was a good leader. He paid fair wages, provided opportunities, created jobs, supported growth. Those things mattered. Of course they mattered. But sitting alone in the truck, they suddenly felt incomplete. Leadership wasn't only about building a successful company. It was about understanding the people who made that success possible. And somewhere along the way, Brian had stopped seeing people clearly. Not intentionally. Gradually. Quietly. One report at a time. One meeting at a time. One busy year at a time. Until employees became numbers on a screen. A sharp feeling moved through him. Regret. Not dramatic regret. Not overwhelming regret. Something quieter. More honest. The regret of realizing there was a better way to lead. And realizing how long it had taken him to see it. His eyes drifted back toward Lisa's house. A woman carried unimaginable grief for 3 years. 3 years. And nobody at work knew. Not because she lied. Not because she hid. Because nobody looked closely enough to notice. Brian included. Especially Brian. The thought hurt. More than he expected. His throat tightened. He swallowed. Looked away. Then another realization surfaced. One he hadn't expected. As much as tonight revealed Lisa's loneliness, it also revealed his own. The realization arrived quietly, almost reluctantly. Brian spent years chasing goals, expanding the company, increasing revenue, reaching milestones. Every achievement led to another target, another objective, another challenge. He kept telling himself happiness would arrive later, after the next accomplishment, after the next success, after the next year. Yet sitting in the truck, he couldn't remember the last time he felt genuinely connected to another person. Not professionally connected, personally connected. There was a difference, and the difference suddenly felt enormous. The company had grown. His bank account had grown. His reputation had grown, but many other parts of his life remained untouched, neglected, waiting. The realization sat heavily inside him. For the first time in years, Brian wasn't thinking about business. He wasn't thinking about growth. He wasn't thinking about profit. He was thinking about people, about Lisa, about himself, about all the things success couldn't provide. His vision blurred slightly. At first, he ignored it. Then he felt warmth against his cheek. A tear. Brian quickly wiped it away. Another followed. Then another. He lowered his head. Not because he felt sorry for Lisa. That wasn't it. Lisa didn't want pity. What moved him was something different. Humility. Perspective. The realization that every person carries a story invisible to everyone else. Some stories contain joy. Others contain heartbreak. Most contain both. Yet from the outside, people rarely know. They see smiles. They see routines. They see appearances. They assume they understand. Brian had done exactly that. And now, he knew better. The tears came quietly, not dramatic, not uncontrollable, just honest. The kind that appear when a difficult truth finally reaches your heart. He sat there for several minutes, allowing the emotions to settle, allowing the lessons to settle, allowing the moment to change him. Because, deep down, he knew something important. He would never look at his employees the same way again. Never. Not after tonight. Not after Lisa. Not after that room. Eventually, Brian wiped his eyes and looked out through the windshield once more. The neighborhood remained peaceful. The house remained still. Life remained unchanged. Yet something inside him had shifted. And some changes, once they begin, never fully reverse. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever misjudged someone's struggles simply because they looked strong? Have you ever assumed someone was doing fine because they smiled every day? If you have, you're not alone. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Because one of the most important lessons in life is this: you never truly know what another person is carrying. And sometimes, the strongest people are fighting battles nobody else can see. The following morning, Brian arrived at work earlier than usual. Not because he had more reports to review. Not because a major problem demanded attention. Not because another deadline was approaching. In fact, for the first time in a very long time, he sat inside his office without opening a single report. The computer remained dark. The stack of paperwork on his desk remained untouched. His coffee cooled beside him, and Brian simply sat there, thinking. The previous night refused to leave his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw pieces of Lisa's house. Not the room itself, the meaning behind it. The years hidden behind an ordinary smile. The life he never knew existed. The pain nobody noticed. Most of all, he kept thinking about one uncomfortable truth. He had spent years believing he understood his employees. Now he knew he didn't. Not really. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Brian glanced at the clock. Employees were beginning to arrive. The workday was starting. Normally, he would immediately dive into meetings. Instead, he stood, picked up his coffee, and walked out of his office. The decision surprised even him. As he stepped onto the factory floor, several employees looked up. A few nodded politely. Others offered quick greetings. Brian returned each greeting. Then he kept walking. The factory buzzed with activity. Machines operated steadily. Materials moved through production lines. Workers focused on their responsibilities. This wasn't unusual. Brian had seen these operations thousands of times. What was unusual was the way he was looking at them. For years, he viewed this floor through numbers, efficiency, output, performance. Today, he found himself looking at people instead. One employee adjusted equipment. Another organized materials. Someone laughed at a joke nearby. Two workers discussed their plans for the weekend. Simple moments. Ordinary moments. Moments Brian normally missed. He slowed his pace. Actually paying attention. Actually listening. The experience felt strangely unfamiliar. Not because he disliked people. Because he had spent so long buried in responsibilities that he had forgotten what genuine interaction felt like. Several employees exchanged surprised glances as he moved through different departments. Brian noticed. He couldn't blame them. Usually when he appeared on the floor, someone assumed there was a problem. An inspection, a deadline, a concern. His presence often made people nervous. Today he wasn't carrying a clipboard. He wasn't reviewing performance. He wasn't searching for mistakes. He was simply there. That alone felt unusual. One employee nearly dropped a tool after noticing Brian standing nearby. "Sorry," the employee said quickly. Brian smiled. "It's okay." The employee looked confused. Brian almost laughed. That reaction told him everything. People expected criticism, not conversation, not friendliness, not curiosity. Brian continued walking. As the morning progressed, he found himself stopping more often, asking questions, listening to answers. Nothing complicated, Nothing forced. Just conversation. The first few interactions felt awkward, mostly because employees weren't sure what was happening. Neither was Brian. But gradually the tension eased. He learned things. Small things. Interesting things. Things reports never mentioned. One employee spent weekends coaching youth sports. Another volunteered regularly. Someone else restored old furniture as a hobby. Simple details. Human details. Brian listened. And the more he listened, the more he realized how much he had missed. The company wasn't simply a collection of departments. It was a collection of lives. Hundreds of stories moving through the same building every day. By lunchtime, word had spread. The boss was acting differently. Employees noticed. Of course they noticed. People always notice when someone changes. Especially someone as predictable as Brian. Several workers exchanged curious looks whenever he approached. Others seemed cautiously optimistic. Some simply appeared confused. The reactions amused him. Around noon, Brian found himself standing near the administrative area. His eyes instinctively moved toward Lisa's desk. The chair was empty. For a brief moment, disappointment touched him. Then he reminded himself she had only missed one day. There was no reason to expect her immediately. Still, the absence felt noticeable. The afternoon passed. Brian continued interacting with employees. The conversations became easier, more natural. The tension that usually followed him around the building slowly faded. Not completely, but enough. By the end of the day, something unexpected happened. Brian actually enjoyed himself. The realization surprised him. For years he treated human interaction as an interruption. Now he found himself looking forward to it. The following morning, he repeated the process. And the morning after that, little by little, a new routine began forming. He still handled reports, still managed the company, still reviewed finances and operations. But he spent less time hiding inside his office, more time walking, more time listening, more time learning. The shift wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen overnight. Yet people noticed. Most of all, Brian noticed. Then, several days after his visit to Lisa's house, he walked into the office and saw something familiar. Lisa was back. She sat at her desk reviewing paperwork. The sight brought an unexpected feeling of relief. She looked healthier than she had that evening. Still tired, but stronger. More like herself, as if she sensed his attention. Lisa looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. Not forced. Not automatic. Brian smiled back. Good morning. Good morning. How are you feeling? Lisa leaned back slightly. Much better. I'm glad. She studied him for a second. Long enough to make Brian slightly uncomfortable. Then, one eyebrow lifted. Can I ask you something? Brian nodded. Sure. What happened to you? Brian blinked. What do you mean? Lisa laughed softly. The entire building is talking about it. Now Brian looked genuinely confused. The entire building? Yes. She set down her pen. Apparently, our boss has started speaking to people. Brian couldn't help smiling. That's a strange thing to be famous for. Lisa laughed again. There are employees making predictions. Predictions? Some think you've joined a motivational seminar. Brian chuckled. Seriously? Oh, it gets better. She leaned forward slightly. One person thinks you're secretly running for mayor. Brian stared at her, then burst out laughing. An actual laugh. Not a polite one. Not a forced one. A genuine laugh. The kind he hadn't experienced in months. Maybe longer. Lisa folded her arms, looking entirely satisfied with herself. There it is. What? Proof. Proof of what? You do know how to laugh. Brian shook his head. Apparently, I needed an employee to confirm that. Lisa grinned. You're welcome. For a moment, both of them laughed, and neither realized it yet. But that simple exchange marked the beginning of something neither expected. Not romance. Not yet. Something far more important. A friendship. The conversation should have ended there. Brian had work to do. Lisa had work to do. The office was busy. The day was moving forward. Yet as Brian walked away from her desk, he found himself smiling. Not because of anything extraordinary. Not because Lisa had told a brilliant joke. Because the interaction felt easy, natural. For years, most conversations in Brian's life revolved around business. Deadlines, budgets, problems, solutions, objectives. Everything carried a purpose. Everything moved toward an outcome. Talking with Lisa felt different. For a few moments, neither person was trying to accomplish anything. They were simply talking. That realization stayed with him longer than he expected. Throughout the day, Brian continued making his rounds through the building. But something had changed. Several times he found himself glancing toward the administrative area. Not intentionally, not even consciously. His eyes simply drifted there. Each time, Lisa remained busy, answering emails, organizing schedules, solving problems, doing exactly what she always did. The difference was that Brian was finally paying attention. Late that afternoon, he stopped near her desk again. Lisa looked up from her computer. "Back already?" Brian raised an eyebrow. "Already? You were here this morning?" "I work here." "That's not what I meant." Brian folded his arms. "Then what did you mean?" Lisa leaned back. The old Brian appeared at people's desks when something was wrong. "The old Brian?" "Yes." Brian sighed dramatically. "Apparently everyone has created multiple versions of me." Lisa nodded. "They have. And this new version?" She pretended to think. "Haven't decided yet." "That's encouraging." "It should be." Brian shook his head. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Lisa pointed toward the coffee cup in his hand. "Still drinking that?" Brian looked down. "Drinking what?" "That coffee." Brian glanced at the nearly empty cup. "Yes." Lisa looked genuinely concerned. "You know there are laws against coffee that bad." Brian laughed. "This again?" "I'm serious. It's coffee." "No." She pointed accusingly. "It's punishment disguised as coffee." Brian looked at the cup, then back at her. "You've never even tasted it." "I don't need to." "How do you know it's bad?" Lisa smiled. "Because every time I see you drinking it, you look disappointed." Brian stared at her. For a moment he had no response. Because she was right. Every morning, he drank the same terrible coffee. Every morning, he hated it. Yet somehow, he never changed brands. Lisa immediately noticed his silence. Her grin widened. "Oh, my goodness." "What?" "I was right." Brian laughed. "I hate that you were right." "You should." She nodded proudly. It was a very accurate observation. Brian walked away, shaking his head, still smiling. That evening, he caught himself thinking about the conversation while driving home. The realization surprised him. Not because the discussion mattered, because it didn't. It was completely insignificant. Coffee, nothing more. Yet he couldn't remember the last time a simple conversation followed him home. The next morning brought another interaction, then another the day after that. The conversations remained casual, unplanned, natural, and somehow they always left Brian in a better mood. One morning he arrived carrying several folders. Lisa immediately noticed. "Did you sleep at the office?" Brian stopped walking. "What?" She pointed toward the folders. "Those look heavy." "They're reports." "Exactly." Brian narrowed his eyes. "I'm sensing criticism." "You should." "I haven't even said anything." "You didn't need to." Lisa smiled. "The reports said enough." Brian laughed. "You know, most employees try not to insult their boss." Lisa looked genuinely confused. Was that an insult? It felt like one. She considered the question, then shrugged. "Maybe a little." Brian continued walking. A few steps later, he heard her laugh behind him. The sound made him smile again. Weeks passed. The conversations became a regular part of his day. Nothing forced. Nothing scheduled. Sometimes they lasted 30 seconds. Sometimes several minutes. The topics rarely mattered. Work frustrations, funny observations, small moments. Yet each conversation chipped away at the serious exterior Brian had spent years building. One afternoon, Lisa looked at his wrist, then looked again, then laughed. Brian immediately became suspicious. "What now?" Lisa pointed. "That watch." Brian glanced down. "My watch?" "Yes." "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing." Her smile widened. "That's the problem." Brian already regretted asking. "What are you talking about?" Lisa folded her arms. "Do you know how expensive that thing looks?" Brian sighed. "Here we go." "I'm serious. It's just a watch." "No." Lisa shook her head. "It's a watch that probably costs more than my car." Brian rubbed his forehead. "It doesn't." Lisa stared at him. "You hesitated." "I did not." "You absolutely did." Brian laughed. "Why are you paying attention to my watch?" "Because it's impossible not to." He shook his head. "It's a normal watch." "Brian." "What?" "You own a manufacturing company." "Yes." "You're a millionaire." "Technically." "You arrived this morning wearing a watch that looks like it has its own retirement plan." Brian burst out laughing. Several nearby employees glanced over. Neither noticed. Lisa looked entirely pleased with herself. There it is again. "What?" "The laugh." Brian pointed at her. "You seem very proud of this." "I am." "Why?" "Because before all this, I wasn't sure you had emotions." Brian nearly choked on his coffee. Lisa immediately started laughing. He laughed too, harder than he expected. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet the rest of the afternoon felt lighter. That became the pattern. Lisa had an unusual ability. She could find humor inside ordinary situations, not through cruelty, not through sarcasm, simply through observation. She noticed things, small things, human things, and somehow she always found a way to make them funny. Brian wasn't used to that. Most people around him treated him differently after learning he was successful. Some became nervous. Others became overly respectful. Many filtered everything they said. Lisa did none of those things. She treated him like a person, not a title, not a bank account, not a position. A person. The difference mattered more than Brian wanted to admit. Several months earlier, he would have dismissed these interactions as distractions. Now they became highlights of his day. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. One Friday afternoon, Lisa wasn't in the office. Nothing serious. She had taken part of the day off for personal errands. Brian knew this. He approved the schedule himself. Yet sometime after lunch, he found himself walking toward the administrative area. Without thinking, without planning, his eyes automatically moved toward her desk. The chair sat empty. For a moment, something felt off. Not wrong, just different. The realization struck immediately. He missed talking to her. The thought caught him completely off guard. Brian stood there for a second, then laughed quietly at himself. Not because the feeling was romantic. It wasn't. Not yet. It was something simpler, something healthier. Friendship. For years, most of his relationships revolved around business, transactions, responsibilities, expectations. Lisa expected none of those things from him. She simply enjoyed the conversations. And somewhere along the way, he had started enjoying them too. Brian glanced once more at the empty desk, then shook his head. A smile appeared despite himself, because for the first time in a very long time he found himself looking forward to seeing someone at work. Not for a meeting, not for a report, not for a decision, just for a conversation. And that realization stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. The realization stayed with Brian longer than he expected. Not the part about missing a conversation, the part about why it mattered. For years, people came and went through his life. Business partners, clients, industry contacts, suppliers, consultants, investors. He spoke with people every day, sometimes hundreds of people in a single week. Yet most of those conversations disappeared the moment they ended. Nothing remained. No connection, no lasting impact. His conversations with Lisa felt different, not because they were dramatic, because they were genuine. There was no agenda, no negotiation, no transaction, just two people talking. The thought followed him into the following week, then the week after that. As the seasons slowly shifted across Montana, a new routine quietly developed. Brian still managed the company, still reviewed reports, still handled meetings, still made difficult decisions, but he no longer spent every waking hour buried inside work. The change wasn't sudden. It happened one choice at a time. A conversation here, a walk through the building there, a lunch break he normally would have skipped. Small adjustments, yet together they began changing something larger. One afternoon, Brian found himself standing near Lisa's desk again. She looked up from her computer. "Should I reserve parking here for you?" Brian smiled. "I didn't realize I visited that often." Lisa stared at him. "You've stopped by 3 times today." "3?" "3." Brian considered it, then shrugged. "I must have important business." Lisa laughed. "Very important." "Exactly. Let me guess." Brian folded his arms. "Go ahead." "You forgot your terrible coffee somewhere." Brian pointed at her. "You really need new material." Lisa grinned. "You really need better coffee." The familiar exchange earned another laugh from both of them. Then something unusual happened. The humor faded naturally. Neither rushed to leave. Neither immediately returned to work. The conversation simply lingered, comfortably. Lisa tilted her head slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Brian immediately looked suspicious. "That's usually dangerous." "It isn't. You said that last time." Lisa smiled. "And you insulted my watch. It deserved it." Brian laughed. "Fine. What's the question?" For a moment Lisa hesitated. Not because she was nervous, because she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. Then she asked quietly, "Do you ever take a day off?" Brian blinked. What kind of question is that? A simple one. He thought about it. The answer should have been easy. Instead, he found himself calculating, trying to remember. That alone felt revealing. Lisa noticed immediately. "Oh no." "What?" "The fact that you're thinking this hard means the answer is terrible." Brian laughed, despite himself. "I take time off." "When?" "Sometimes." "That's not an answer." Brian rubbed the back of his neck. The gesture made Lisa smile, because for once, he actually looked uncomfortable. "You know," she said softly, "most people usually have to think about work." Brian narrowed his eyes. "Meaning?" "Meaning, you seem to have the opposite problem." The comment lingered. Not because it was insulting, because it was accurate. Brian leaned against a nearby desk. For a moment he looked out toward the office floor. Employees moved through their routines. Phones rang. Conversations drifted through the building. Life continued around them. Then he answered honestly, "I don't really know what to do when I'm not working." Lisa's expression changed. The humor remained, but something more thoughtful appeared beside it. "What do you mean?" Brian shrugged. "I've been doing this for so long that work became normal." He glanced toward the building around them. "The company needs attention." Lisa listened quietly. "It always needs attention." Brian nodded. "Exactly. And if you stopped working for one day, it wouldn't stop needing attention." Lisa smiled. "That's not what I asked." Brian laughed softly. She had a habit of doing that, cutting through complicated explanations, getting directly to the point. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lisa asked another question, one that surprised him. "Were you always like this?" Brian stared at her. The question seemed simple, yet the answer wasn't. His eyes drifted toward the windows, toward the distant mountains, visible beyond town. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he shook his head. "No." Lisa waited. Brian appreciated that. She never rushed people, never filled silence unnecessarily. Eventually he continued. "When I started the company, I thought it would only be temporary." "Temporary?" "All the long hours." He smiled faintly. I kept telling myself things would settle down eventually. Lisa nodded. A lot of people made promises like that to themselves. Brian continued. Then the company grew. And you got busier? Exactly. Another pause. Then it grew again. Lisa already knew where the story was heading. And you got busier again. Brian laughed quietly. Pretty much. The smile faded. Not completely. Just enough. There was always another goal. Lisa listened. Another milestone. Another pause. Another reason to wait. His voice carried something different now. Reflection. Regret. Not overwhelming regret. The kind people feel when looking back at years they can't recover. Lisa noticed. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Brian stared toward the floor. There were relationships. The sentence arrived unexpectedly. Lisa remained silent. There were people who mattered. A faint smile crossed his face, then disappeared. I always thought there would be more time. The honesty surprised even him. He wasn't someone who talked about personal things, especially at work. Yet somehow talking with Lisa felt different. Safe. Not because she judged less. Because she listened more. Brian exhaled slowly. I missed birthdays. His eyes remained distant. Family gatherings. Another pause. Important moments. Lisa's expression softened. She understood more than he realized. Not because their experiences matched. Because loss always leaves traces. Different losses. Different stories. Similar lessons. Brian continued. At the time, it felt necessary. He shrugged. Maybe some of it was. Then he laughed quietly, without humor. Maybe some of it wasn't. The office seemed unusually quiet around them. Not literally. The sounds still existed, but neither paid attention anymore. The conversation had become something deeper, something more personal. Lisa folded her hands together. For several moments, she considered his words. Then she asked gently, "Do you ever get lonely?" The question landed directly. No detours. No disguises. Brian looked at her. Really looked at her. Most people would never ask that. Most people avoided questions like that. Yet somehow it felt natural coming from Lisa. He thought about giving a polite answer. A safe answer. A professional answer. Instead, he surprised himself. Yeah. The word came quietly, honestly. No explanation. No defense. Just truth. Lisa nodded. Not dramatically. Not with pity. Simply understanding. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Lisa smiled softly. You know something? What? I think we're more alike than either of us expected. Brian looked genuinely surprised. Really? She nodded. Different reasons? A brief pause. But similar habits. Brian considered that, then laughed. I don't think anyone has ever compared me to you before. Lisa smiled. They should. I'm not convinced. You should be. Brian shook his head, still smiling. Yet the conversation remained with him, because deep down, he understood what she meant. Both of them had been hiding from parts of life. Lisa buried herself in work after losing her son. Brian buried himself in work while chasing success. Different paths, different pain, the same escape. Work. For several moments, neither said it aloud. They didn't need to. The understanding already existed. Quiet. Unspoken. Real. Eventually, Lisa glanced toward the clock, then back at Brian. I almost forgot. Brian raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. It's not. That's exactly what you always say. Lisa laughed, then reached for a flyer sitting on her desk. She handed it to him. Brian looked down. The company was hosting a community appreciation event the following month, a tradition that had existed for years. Food, music, employees, families, local residents. Nothing complicated. Nothing formal. Just people spending time together. Brian looked back at her. I know about the event. I know you know. Then, why are you giving me this? Lisa folded her arms. Because unlike every other year, She paused. A playful smile appeared. I actually expect you to show up. Brian laughed. That's your big announcement? I'm serious. I always stop by. For 10 minutes. That's not true. Lisa gave him a look. Brian sighed. Fine. 15 minutes. Exactly. She pointed toward him. This year, you're staying. Brian smiled. And if I don't? Lisa leaned back confidently. I'll tell everyone your watch has its own retirement plan. Brian laughed again. A genuine laugh. The kind that came easier now. That's blackmail. It is. And you're admitting it? Absolutely. Brian shook his head, still smiling. Then he looked down at the flyer again. Something about the invitation felt different. Not because of the event. Because of who invited him. For the first time in years, spending time with people outside of work no longer sounded like an obligation. It sounded appealing. The realization surprised him, and somehow, as he looked back at Lisa, he had a feeling that accepting that invitation would matter far more than either of them realized. Neither knew it yet, but the friendship growing between them was only beginning. The company event arrived on a cool Saturday evening. For years, it had been one of the town's favorite gatherings. Employees brought families. Neighbors stopped by. Children ran across open fields. Music drifted through the air. Food tables stretched across the property. Laughter seemed to come from every direction. The event wasn't designed to impress anyone. That was part of its charm. People came because they enjoyed being together. Brian usually attended out of obligation. He arrived, shook hands, thanked employees, stayed briefly, then found an excuse to leave. That had become his tradition. This year felt different before it even began. As he parked his truck and stepped onto the grounds, he immediately noticed something. People weren't approaching him with the same caution. The atmosphere had changed. Several employees waved from across the field. Others greeted him casually. The distance that once existed between Brian and the workforce had begun shrinking. Not disappearing, but shrinking. Brian found himself smiling more than usual. The realization felt strange, yet welcome. He spent the first hour moving through the gathering, talking, listening, meeting spouses, meeting parents, hearing stories, learning things. Many employees seemed surprised he remembered details from previous conversations. The reactions amused him. Apparently listening had become a memorable event. As sunset approached, the Montana sky transformed. The horizon glowed with shades of orange and gold. Long shadows stretched across the field. The temperature dropped slightly. People gathered closer together. Music continued playing nearby. Children chased one another across the grass. The evening carried a peaceful energy. Brian stood near the edge of the event holding a cup of coffee. Actual good coffee this time. At least according to Lisa's standards. He smiled at the thought. As if summoned by the memory, Lisa appeared beside him. You finally upgraded. Brian looked down at his cup. I knew this was coming. Lisa laughed. You have no idea how proud I am. Of my coffee choices? Of your personal growth. Brian shook his head. I've accomplished a lot in life. None of it compares to this. They both laughed. The conversation felt effortless. It always did now. For a while they remained near the gathering, watching people enjoy the evening. Talking occasionally, comfortable with silence when conversation wasn't necessary. Then Lisa glanced toward the open field beyond the event. Want to walk? The question caught Brian slightly off guard. Not because it felt unusual, because it felt natural. Sure. Together they moved away from the crowd. The sounds of music and conversation gradually softened behind them. The field opened into a wide view of the surrounding landscape. The sky stretched endlessly above. Stars began appearing one by one. The air smelled clean, fresh, peaceful. For several minutes, they simply walked. No destination, no urgency, just movement. Eventually Lisa spoke. You know what this reminds me of? Brian looked over. What? When I was little. A smile touched her face. My family spent a lot of time outside. Brian listened. We had these huge family gatherings. Her smile widened. Everybody brought food? Everybody? Everybody. She laughed. There was always enough food for 3 neighborhoods. Brian smiled. I believe that, Lisa continued. My grandmother used to say, nobody should leave hungry. The memory clearly meant something to her. Brian could hear it in her voice. Did it work? Lisa laughed. Not even close. They both smiled. Then she looked up at the stars. We'd stay outside for hours. Her expression softened. Talking. Singing. Listening to stories. For a moment, Brian could almost see it. A younger Lisa, surrounded by family, by warmth, by tradition, by community. What about you? She asked. Brian thought for a moment. My family was different. Lisa waited. My parents worked constantly. He smiled faintly. I guess that's where I learned it. The observation carried more truth than humor. Lisa noticed. Did you spend much time together? Some. Brian shrugged. We weren't the type to talk about feelings. Lisa laughed. You described half the country. Brian smiled. Fair point. They continued walking. The conversation slowly deepened. Neither forced it. The evening seemed to invite honesty. Stories surfaced naturally. Childhood memories. Favorite holidays. Family traditions. Embarrassing moments. Small victories. Old disappointments. Pieces of life. At one point, Lisa laughed so hard she had to stop walking. Brian stood there watching her. For a moment he forgot everything else. The company. The responsibilities. The pressure. All of it. The sound of her laughter felt unexpectedly important. The realization caught him off guard. He looked away, trying to ignore it, trying to understand it. Lisa eventually recovered. That was your fault. My fault? You told the story. Brian laughed. You were the one laughing. Because it was funny. They resumed walking. A comfortable silence settled between them. Eventually, the conversation shifted again, toward faith. Not in a formal way, not as a debate, simply as part of life. Lisa spoke about how faith helped her survive difficult seasons, how it gave her strength when answers were impossible to find. Brian listened carefully. He didn't pretend to have all the same experiences, but he understood the importance of holding on to something during hard times. The discussion became thoughtful, honest, neither trying to convince the other of anything, simply sharing, respecting, listening. As the night grew darker, the conversation turned toward dreams. Not childhood dreams, adult dreams. The ones people quietly carry. The ones they rarely discuss. Lisa surprised him first. I always wanted to help people. Brian smiled. You already do. Lisa looked genuinely touched, then laughed. That wasn't supposed to be the answer. It was the truth. For a moment, she looked away, trying to hide how much the comment meant. Brian noticed, but didn't mention it. Eventually, Lisa asked the same question. What about you? Brian looked toward the stars. The answer took longer, not because he didn't know, because he wasn't sure how to say it. Finally he spoke. For years, my dream was success. Lisa listened quietly. I thought everything would make sense once I reached it. A faint smile appeared. And? Brian laughed softly. It turns out, life is more complicated than that. Lisa smiled. You don't say. The moment lingered. Both of them understood there was more beneath the surface. More that neither was fully ready to say. The conversation continued. Regrets surfaced. Not dramatic confessions. Honest reflections. Brian talked about opportunities missed. Moments postponed. Years spent chasing goals. Lisa talked about things she wished she had appreciated more. Time she wished could be revisited. Memories she held close. The emotional distance between them continued shrinking. Neither noticed it happening. Or perhaps they did. Perhaps neither wanted to acknowledge it. The stars stretched above them. The event continued somewhere behind them. Yet the world felt smaller now, quieter, more personal. Eventually they stopped walking. The field opened into a wide view of the town below. Lights glowed in the distance. The night felt endless. For several moments, neither spoke. They simply stood there, looking outward, thinking, feeling. Something had changed. Not dramatically, not enough to name, but enough to notice. Enough to make both of them aware that this friendship was becoming increasingly important. Neither said it. Neither needed to. The feeling remained unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. And as they finally turned back toward the event, both carried the same quiet realization. Something was different now. Neither knew exactly what it meant, but both felt it. The days following the company event felt normal, at least on the surface. The company continued operating. Schedules remained full. Departments stayed busy. Deadlines arrived and passed. Everything appeared exactly the same. Yet something had shifted beneath the routine. Neither Brian nor Lisa talked about the walk that night. Neither brought up the conversations. Neither mentioned standing beneath the stars discussing dreams, regrets, and pieces of themselves they rarely shared. The memory simply remained there. Quietly, like a song neither person could stop hearing. Brian noticed it first. A few mornings after the event, he found himself walking toward the administrative area. The habit wasn't new. He had been stopping by Lisa's desk regularly for months. What felt different now was his awareness of it. Halfway there, he stopped, looked around, then laughed softly at himself. Because he already knew exactly why he was walking in that direction. Not for a report, not for a business question, not for work, for Lisa. The realization made him uncomfortable, not because he disliked it, because he wasn't sure what to do with it. For years, his life followed simple rules. Work first, everything else second. Feelings rarely complicated things, because he rarely allowed them enough space to grow. Now things felt less straightforward. When he finally reached her desk, Lisa looked up. A smile appeared immediately. Not forced, not polite, genuine. Brian noticed how quickly it happened. That realization didn't help. "Good morning." "Good morning." Lisa tilted her head. "You look thoughtful." Brian sighed. "That's never a good sign." She laughed. "Usually not." The conversation continued normally, yet Brian noticed something. He paid more attention to her expressions now. The way her eyes brightened when she laughed. The way she paused before delivering a joke. The way she sometimes stared at the screen while thinking through a problem. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of details people notice when someone matters. That thought stayed with him long after he walked away. Across the office, Lisa was having her own problems. Not work problems. Those remained easy. The problem was Brian, or more specifically, how often she thought about him. She noticed it during simple moments. A funny story would happen. Her first thought became, "I should tell Brian." A strange article would appear online. She wondered what Brian would say about it. A joke would come to mind. She automatically imagined his reaction. At first she ignored it. Then she tried dismissing it. Eventually she realized ignoring it wasn't working. Because the friendship had become important. More important than she expected. That realization created a new complication. Professional boundaries. The issue hovered quietly in the background, never fully leaving. Brian owned the company. Lisa worked there. Neither could forget that. Even if they wanted to, the fact remained. And both of them respected it. Perhaps too much. One afternoon, Brian stopped by her desk, carrying paperwork. Lisa looked at the documents, then looked at him, then back at the documents. "What?" Brian immediately became suspicious. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one that means you're judging me." Lisa smiled. "I am judging you." "There it is." She pointed at the folders. "How many reports are in there?" Brian glanced down. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "No." Lisa stared dramatically toward the ceiling. "There's no helping him." Brian laughed. I'm standing right here. I know. You're impossible. Lisa smiled. That's one of my better qualities. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet after Brian walked away, both of them found themselves smiling. The pattern continued. Day after day. Week after week. The conversations became longer. Not intentionally. They simply kept finding reasons to talk. Sometimes work started the discussion. Then the topic shifted naturally. Books, music, memories, funny observations, things they noticed, things they wondered about. Neither rushed the conversations. Neither watched the clock. That alone felt unusual. One evening, most employees had already gone home. Brian passed through the administrative area and noticed Lisa still working. He stopped. You're here late. Lisa looked up. So are you. That's different. She laughed. How? Brian opened his mouth, then closed it. Lisa folded her arms. Exactly. He shook his head. I walked into that one. You sprinted into it. Brian laughed, then glanced at the clock. It was later than either of them realized. For a moment neither returned to work. The conversation continued instead. Easy, comfortable, natural. Eventually, a pause settled between them. Not awkward, just quiet. Brian found himself studying the room. Lisa found herself studying Brian. Neither spoke, yet both became aware of something. The silence felt different now, not empty, meaningful. That realization made both of them look away almost simultaneously. The timing would have been funny if it wasn't so revealing. Lisa focused on paperwork. Brian pretended to check his watch. Neither fooled the other. The moment passed, but neither forgot it. As weeks continued moving forward, the emotional tension slowly increased. Not dramatic tension, not dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. Small moments, subtle moments, the kind that matter most. Brian remembering details Lisa mentioned weeks earlier. Lisa noticing when Brian seemed stressed before he said a word. A glance, lasting slightly longer than normal. A smile, arriving a little too quickly. Neither spoke about it. Neither wanted to. Acknowledging it would force questions neither felt ready to answer. One afternoon, Brian found himself standing outside his office looking across the building. Lisa was helping someone solve a scheduling issue. Nothing unusual. She did that constantly. Yet Brian remained there longer than necessary. Watching. Not because she was doing anything remarkable. Because he admired the way she treated people. Patient, kind, present. The realization struck unexpectedly. He respected her deeply. Not because of what she had survived. Not because of her work. Because of who she was. Across the room, Lisa eventually looked up. Their eyes met. Neither smiled immediately. For a second, they simply looked at one another. Then both smiled at exactly the same time. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet Brian carried it with him for the rest of the day. Lisa did too. Neither admitted it, not even to themselves. At least, not completely. Professional boundaries remained firmly in place. Neither crossed them. Neither attempted to. The friendship mattered too much to risk. The company mattered too much. Their respect for one another mattered too much. Still, some truths become harder to ignore over time. One evening, Lisa sat alone at home reading. She reached the end of a chapter, closed the book, and immediately thought about a conversation she wanted to have with Brian about it. The realization made her laugh, then sigh, then stare at the ceiling, because she understood exactly what it meant. Across town, Brian experienced something similar. A funny story happened during a meeting. Without thinking, he found himself looking forward to telling Lisa about it. The realization arrived before the meeting even ended, and it followed him all the way home. Both of them were beginning to recognize something. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to create uncertainty. Enough to raise questions. Enough to complicate an otherwise simple friendship. Neither acted on those feelings. Neither discussed them. Instead, they continued exactly as before. Talking, laughing, listening, working, pretending everything remained unchanged. Yet, deep down, both understood something important. The friendship had reached a place neither expected, and neither knew exactly where it was leading. That uncertainty followed them into the weeks ahead. Quiet, persistent, impossible to fully ignore. For the first time, both Brian and Lisa found themselves standing in unfamiliar emotional territory. Neither knew what came next, and that uncertainty lingered long after the conversations ended. The uncertainty didn't disappear. If anything, it became more noticeable. Not because Brian and Lisa talked about it, because they didn't. Both continued moving through their days exactly as before. Work continued. Conversations continued. Life continued. Yet something had changed beneath the surface, and both of them knew it. The problem was simple. Neither knew what to do about it. Brian understood the situation better than most people would. He owned the company. Lisa worked there. No matter how much he respected her, that reality remained. Crossing certain lines carried consequences. Questions, complications. The last thing Brian wanted was for Lisa to ever feel pressured. The thought bothered him more than he expected, because the friendship mattered. Perhaps more than he was ready to admit. One Monday morning, Brian made a decision. A practical decision. A responsible decision. At least that was how he justified it. He would create a little distance. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough space to clear his head. Just enough space to regain perspective. The plan sounded reasonable until he actually tried it. That morning he stayed inside his office. The entire morning. No casual walk through the administrative area. No stopping by Lisa's desk. No conversations about coffee. No jokes. No friendly interruptions. Instead, he focused entirely on work. Reports. Budgets. Forecasts. Meetings. Everything that once occupied his attention so completely. For a few hours, it almost worked. Almost. Then lunchtime arrived, and Brian realized something. The work felt heavier. Not because the tasks were difficult, because the day felt strangely empty. The realization annoyed him. He was a grown man, a successful businessman. Surely he could survive a single day without a conversation. Yet sometime after lunch he caught himself looking toward the administrative area. The habit happened automatically. The moment he realized it, he looked away, then laughed quietly at himself. Because avoiding someone suddenly required far more effort than talking to them ever had. Across the building, Lisa was having a similar experience. She noticed Brian's absence almost immediately. Not his physical absence, his conversational absence. The difference mattered. Normally he stopped by at least once during the day, sometimes twice, occasionally more. Today, nothing. At first she ignored it. People got busy. That happened. Then the morning passed. Still nothing. By early afternoon, she found herself glancing toward his office. The realization irritated her. Not because she was upset with Brian, because she knew exactly why she was looking. And she didn't particularly enjoy the answer. The following day brought more of the same. Brian remained polite, friendly, professional, but noticeably more distant. The change was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Lisa did. Of course she did. Several days later they crossed paths near a hallway. Morning. Morning? Both smiled. Both kept walking. The entire interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet somehow it felt longer. Stranger? Incomplete. That night, Brian sat alone in his house. A financial report remained open on his laptop. He had been staring at the same page for nearly 15 minutes, not reading it, staring at it. Eventually, he closed the laptop, leaning back in his chair. The silence inside the house felt unusually loud. His eyes drifted toward the living room window. Darkness stretched beyond the glass. For years, evenings like this felt normal, comfortable even. Now something felt missing. Not dramatic, not painful, just noticeable. The realization arrived quietly. He missed her, not in a romantic fantasy, not in some exaggerated way. He missed talking to her, missed laughing, missed sharing small pieces of the day. missed being understood without needing lengthy explanations. The thought lingered, refusing to leave. Across town, Lisa sat at her kitchen table, sorting paperwork. The task should have required her full attention. Instead, her thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. Toward work. Toward Brian. Toward the strange distance that had appeared between them. Eventually, she stopped organizing papers altogether, resting her chin in her hand, thinking. The answer became difficult to avoid. She missed him too. Not because she needed him. Not because she depended on him. Because his presence had become important. And now she understood exactly how important. The realization made her uncomfortable, then sad, then thoughtful. The emotions arrived one after another. Neither Brian nor Lisa wanted to admit what was happening. Both continued pretending the distance was helping. It wasn't. The distance was revealing things. Feelings became clearer when conversations disappeared. Appreciation became clearer when presence disappeared. Sometimes absence acts like a mirror, showing people truths they successfully ignored when everything felt normal. Several more days passed. The emotional distance remained, yet it became increasingly difficult to maintain. One afternoon, Brian walked through the building carrying documents. A familiar laugh reached him from across the office. He turned instinctively. Lisa, talking with someone, smiling, laughing, completely unaware he was watching. The sight triggered an unexpected reaction. Relief. Simple relief. Just seeing her happy improved his mood. Brian immediately recognized what that meant, and the recognition unsettled him, because feelings don't become less real when ignored. Sometimes they become more obvious. He continued walking, but the realization stayed with him. Later that week, Lisa experienced her own moment of clarity. A difficult scheduling issue had created stress throughout the office. Normally, she would have solved it and moved on. Instead, halfway through the process, she found herself thinking, Brian would know exactly how to handle this. The thought appeared naturally, without effort, without planning. She smiled, despite herself, because she finally understood. Trust. That was part of it. She trusted him, respected him, valued his opinion. The friendship had grown deeper than either of them intended, and neither knew how to step backward. The following Friday, circumstances finally pushed them together again. Brian stopped near her desk. Neither had planned the conversation. Neither expected it. Yet suddenly there they were, standing face to face. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lisa broke first. You've been avoiding me. Brian blinked. Direct. Honest. Completely Lisa. I haven't been avoiding you. Lisa stared at him. The silence lasted exactly long enough. Brian sighed. Okay. Maybe a little. A smile appeared, despite her efforts. I knew it. Brian laughed softly. Of course you did. The tension immediately eased. Not completely, but enough. Enough for both of them to breathe again. Neither discussed feelings. Neither confessed anything. Neither crossed boundaries. Yet something important happened. The distance ended. And in ending, it revealed the truth. The friendship mattered. More than either of them expected. More than either of them planned. Neither knew what came next. Neither acted on the realization. Not yet. But both finally understood something they could no longer deny. Life felt better when the other person was part of it. That understanding stayed with Lisa long after work ended. That evening, she returned home, carrying a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, hope, fear, uncertainty. She moved through the house quietly. The familiar rooms greeted her. The familiar silence greeted her. Yet something felt different. Not because of Brian, because of herself. For the first time in years, she found herself thinking seriously about the future. Not surviving, living. The difference mattered. As the evening continued, her attention gradually shifted toward the hallway. Toward the room she had carefully preserved for 3 years. Toward the room she cleaned every week. Toward the room she protected with devotion and love. She stood there for several moments, simply looking, thinking, remembering. The emotions felt complicated, but something inside her had changed. Not enough to erase grief, Not enough to erase memory, enough to create movement, enough to create courage, enough to create possibility. For years she had remained frozen between loss and healing. Now, for the first time, she wondered if it might be possible to honor the past without remaining trapped inside it. The thought scared her, yet it also brought peace. And as she stood in the hallway looking toward that room, Lisa understood that a decision was approaching. Not tonight, not yet, but soon, very soon. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Do you believe healing sometimes requires letting go without forgetting? Do you think it's possible to honor precious memories while still allowing yourself to move forward? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, because Lisa is about to face the most difficult step of her healing journey, and what she discovers next will change everything. Lisa stood alone in the hallway. The house was quiet. Outside, the evening settled gently over the neighborhood. Inside, only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood interrupted the silence. Her eyes remained fixed on the bedroom door, the same door she had opened thousands of times, the same room she cleaned every week, the same room she protected for 3 years. Yet tonight felt different, not easier, different. The realization lingered inside her. For years she had become an expert at surviving. Wake up, go to work, keep moving, keep functioning, keep smiling. The routine carried her forward. But surviving and living were not the same thing. That truth had become impossible to ignore. Slowly, Lisa stepped forward. Her hand rested against the doorknob. For a moment she hesitated, not because she was afraid of the room, because she knew the room too well. Every corner, every shelf, every memory. She took a slow breath, then opened the door. The room greeted her exactly as it always had. The neatly made bed, the books, the toy cars, the carefully arranged belongings. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. Lisa stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. For several moments, she simply stood there, looking, remembering, allowing memories to come and go without fighting them. Eventually, her attention moved toward the closet. Not because something was there, because she suddenly remembered something. A box. A storage box she hadn't touched in years. The memory arrived unexpectedly. Lisa walked toward the closet, knelt down, reached behind several containers, and found it. A worn cardboard box. Dust lightly covered the lid. The sight surprised her. Very little in the room ever gathered dust, yet somehow this box had remained hidden, forgotten, untouched. She carefully lifted it, carried it to the bed, then sat down. The box rested in her lap. For a long moment, she stared at it. Her fingers traced the edges. Memories began surfacing before she even opened it. Hospital visits, birthday parties, school projects, bedtime stories, tiny hands, tiny shoes, tiny laughter. A lifetime compressed into 6 short years. Lisa swallowed hard, then slowly lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a stack of photographs. She smiled immediately, not because the memories were painless, because they were precious. She picked up the first photo. A younger version of herself smiled at the camera. Beside her stood her son, both covered in cake frosting, both laughing. The memory returned instantly. A birthday celebration, a ruined kitchen, hours of cleaning afterward, and not a second of regret. Lisa laughed softly, then wiped a tear from her cheek. Another photograph followed, then another. Family gatherings, school activities, holiday mornings, ordinary moments, the kind that become priceless once they're gone. The room grew quieter as she continued sorting through the images. Each photo carried its own story, its own emotion, its own piece of a life she refused to forget. Eventually, she placed the photographs aside. Beneath them sat a collection of greeting cards, birthday cards, holiday cards, handmade cards, some decorated with uneven handwriting, others covered with drawings. Lisa carefully opened one. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Inside was a simple message. Nothing extraordinary, Just love, pure and uncomplicated. The kind children give freely, without conditions, without hesitation. Her eyes blurred again. She smiled through the tears, then continued. More cards, more memories, more reminders. Each item felt like opening a door into another chapter of her life. Hours seemed to disappear. The outside world faded. Only the room remained. Only the memories. Only the box. Eventually her fingers touched something smaller. She paused, then carefully lifted it. A hospital bracelet. The sight stole her breath. For several seconds she couldn't move. The bracelet rested in her palm. Tiny, fragile, powerful. Another bracelet lay beneath it. Then another. Lisa stared at them. 1,000 memories arrived at once. Hospital hallways, waiting rooms, doctors, hope, fear, long nights, longer days. The bracelets seemed impossibly small, yet somehow they carried the weight of entire years. Lisa gently placed them beside the photographs, then closed her eyes. The emotion hit harder now, not because of grief alone, because she was allowing herself to feel everything. The joy, the pain, the love, the loss, all of it. For years, she had kept moving. Tonight she stopped running from the memories, and the experience felt exhausting, but necessary. Eventually, she opened her eyes again. The box still contained several items. Among them sat a bundle of papers tied together with an old ribbon. Lisa frowned slightly. She didn't immediately remember them. Curious, she untied the ribbon. Inside were drawings, notes, school assignments, random pieces of childhood. She smiled, then froze, because near the bottom sat an envelope, folded carefully, unopened. Her name written across the front. Lisa stared at it, confused. She picked it up, turned it over. No stamp, no mailing address, nothing. Just her name. Her heartbeat quickened. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her hands began trembling. Slowly, almost cautiously, she opened the envelope. Inside rested a folded sheet of paper. The edges showed signs of age. She unfolded it carefully, then began reading. The first few lines brought an immediate smile. Simple thoughts. Simple words. Exactly what a child would write. Yet every sentence felt priceless. Lisa continued reading. The room disappeared around her. The world disappeared around her. Only the letter existed. Only the words. Then she reached a particular section, and everything stopped. Her breath caught. The tears arrived instantly. Not gradually, instantly. She pressed one hand against her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to steady herself. The letter blurred. She wiped her eyes. Read the line again, then again, as if hoping she misunderstood it, but she hadn't. The words remained exactly the same. Simple, honest, powerful. The room spun with emotion. Years of grief collided with years of love. Lisa lowered the letter, then broke. The tears came freely now, uncontrolled, raw. She bent forward, clutching the paper, allowing herself to feel everything she had spent years holding together. For a long time, she simply cried. Not because the letter hurt, because it healed, because it reached a part of her heart she thought would remain frozen forever. Eventually, she looked down at the page once more. Her vision blurred again. Near the end of the letter, one final request waited. One final promise. One final message. And as Lisa read those words through tears, she felt her entire world shift. The letter said, "If you're sad after I'm gone, promise you'll keep living. Promise you'll keep laughing." Lisa sat motionless on the edge of the bed. The letter remained in her hands. The room had become completely quiet again. Not because the emotions had passed, because they had settled into something deeper. The tears still lingered. Occasionally another slipped down her cheek. Yet the overwhelming wave that had crashed over her moments earlier had begun to ease. Now came something else. Reflection. For a long time, she simply stared at the page, reading the words again, then again, and again. Every sentence felt different now, not because the words changed, Because she changed. For years, she had viewed every memory through the lens of loss. Every photograph, every birthday card, every toy, every piece of that room. Everything reminded her of what was gone. Tonight, for the first time, she noticed something else. Love. The letter wasn't filled with sadness. It wasn't filled with fear. It wasn't filled with regret. It was filled with love. Simple love. Honest love. The kind only a child could express without complication. Lisa smiled through fresh tears. Her fingertips moved gently across the paper. The handwriting was uneven in places. Certain words leaned awkwardly. A few letters were larger than others. Perfect imperfections. The kind that made the letter feel alive. The kind that made it feel close. She continued reading. Some sections made her laugh softly. Others brought tears. One moment she found herself smiling. The next she was wiping her eyes again. The emotional journey felt impossible to control. And for the first time in years, she stopped trying to control it. The line continued echoing inside her mind. Promise you'll keep living. Promise you'll keep laughing. The simplicity of it made it even more powerful. Not a complicated request. Not an impossible request. Yet somehow it was the very thing she had struggled to do. Lisa slowly looked around the room. At the books. The toys. The carefully preserved memories. A difficult realization arrived. She had survived these past 3 years. But had she truly lived? The answer came immediately. No. She had existed. Functioned. Worked. Smiled when necessary. Completed responsibilities. Paid bills. Maintained routines. But living? Real living? That was different. Somewhere along the way, she stopped allowing herself that. Not intentionally. It happened gradually. 1 day at a time. 1 week at a time. 1 year at a time. Grief became familiar. Predictable. Safe. Moving forward felt frightening. Because moving forward sometimes feels dangerously close to leaving someone behind. Yet the letter challenged that belief. The words seemed to ask a question. What if healing wasn't betrayal? What if happiness wasn't abandonment? What if continuing to live didn't mean forgetting? Lisa lowered her head. Fresh tears fell onto the paper. This time, they weren't only tears of sorrow. Something else mixed with them. Relief. The realization surprised her. Because deep down, she knew something. She had been waiting for permission. Permission to stop feeling guilty. Permission to smile. Permission to dream. Permission to move forward. And somehow that permission arrived in the form of a forgotten letter hidden inside an old box. The thought felt almost unbelievable. Yet it was true. She looked at the final lines again, then carefully folded the letter, not to put it away, to hold it close. For several minutes she remained seated, thinking, remembering, listening to the quiet around her. Eventually, her gaze shifted toward the clock. The hour had grown late. Yet one thought continued returning. Brian. The thought appeared naturally, not because she needed advice, not because she wanted comfort, because she wanted to share the moment with someone who would understand its importance, someone who had listened without judgment, someone who had never tried to fix her grief, someone who respected it. The following afternoon, Lisa asked if Brian had a few minutes to talk. The request immediately caught his attention. Not because it was unusual, because something in her voice sounded different, calmer, lighter, more certain. A short time later, they sat together inside Brian's office. The door remained open. The conversation remained professional. Yet the atmosphere felt personal. Brian noticed the envelope in Lisa's hands almost immediately. His attention lingered on it, not because he was curious, because he sensed it mattered. Lisa looked down at the letter. Then back at him. I found something. Brian waited. No interruption. No assumptions. Just patience. Lisa smiled softly. The expression carried emotion, but not the same pain he remembered from her bedroom. This felt different. Hopeful. Then she handed him the letter. For a moment, Brian looked surprised. You want me to read it? Lisa nodded. I do. The seriousness in her voice made him careful. Brian accepted the paper, then began reading. The office disappeared around him, just as the bedroom disappeared around Lisa the night before. Every sentence carried sincerity. Every line reflected innocence. Every word reflected love. Brian found himself smiling, then swallowing hard, then smiling again. The emotional shift happened gradually, until he reached the final request. Promise, you'll keep living. Promise, you'll keep laughing. Brian stopped reading. The words settled heavily inside him, not because they only applied to Lisa, because they applied to him too. The realization hit with unexpected force. For several moments, he stared at the paper, unable to continue, unable to immediately speak. His throat tightened, his chest felt heavy. The office remained silent. Neither rushed the moment. Finally, Brian looked up. His eyes met Lisa's, and for a second, neither needed explanations. Both understood. The letter wasn't only about grief, it was about life. The life people postpone. The life people delay. The life people promise themselves they'll enjoy someday. Brian slowly looked back at the page. A difficult truth surfaced. For years, he had done exactly that. Every goal led to another goal. Every achievement led to another target. Every success became another reason to wait. Wait until next year. Wait until the company grows. Wait until things settle down. Wait until there is more time. The problem was simple. There was always another reason to wait. And waiting slowly became a lifestyle. Brian leaned back in his chair. The realization settled over him. Lisa had been trapped by grief. He had been trapped by ambition. Different prisons. Similar results. Both had stopped fully living. Both had convinced themselves they would start later. Both had postponed happiness. The similarities felt impossible to ignore. Brian laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because the truth felt strangely obvious now. Lisa noticed. What? Brian shook his head. I spent years chasing the next thing. His voice carried reflection. The next milestone. Another pause. The next success. Lisa listened, quietly. Brian smiled. And somehow I convinced myself life would begin after that. The honesty surprised neither of them, because both already knew it was true. For a while they simply sat there, talking, reflecting, connecting pieces they had never connected before. The conversation felt different from previous conversations. Deeper, clearer. Neither person was trying to impress the other. Neither was hiding. The letter removed something. A barrier. A fear. A weight. Eventually, Lisa looked down at the envelope, then toward the office window. Sunlight stretched across the parking lot outside. Life moved forward, steadily, patiently, waiting for nobody. A thought arrived. Simple, yet powerful. I think I'm ready. Brian looked at her. Ready for what? Lisa smiled. A real smile. One that reached her eyes. One that carried peace. To move forward. The words lingered between them. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were earned. 3 years of grief. 3 years of survival. 3 years of standing still. And now movement. Not forgetting. Never forgetting. Moving forward. There was a difference. Brian understood immediately. The look on his face told her everything. No explanation needed. No speech required. Just understanding. The kind that only comes from shared growth. The kind that only comes from honest friendship. For the first time in years, both of them felt something changing. Not around them. Inside them. Healing. Quiet. Steady. Real. And as the afternoon light filled the office, both Brian and Lisa made the same decision. The past would always matter. The memories would always matter. The love would always matter. But neither of them wanted to spend the rest of their lives waiting for life to begin. It was time to move forward. Together. Not as a romantic declaration. Not yet. As two people finally choosing to live. The decision to move forward did not transform everything overnight, Healing rarely works that way. There was no magical morning where Lisa woke up without grief. There was no dramatic moment where Brian suddenly became a completely different man. Real change arrived quietly, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one step at a time. And somehow those small steps changed everything. A few days after sharing the letter with Brian, Lisa stood once again in her son's room. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the window. Dust floated through the beams of light. The room looked exactly as it always had. The neatly made bed, the books, the toy cars, the photographs, the carefully folded clothes. For years she had protected every detail. Every object remained frozen in place. Every shelf remained untouched. Every memory remained exactly where she left it. Today felt different, not because she wanted to erase the room, because she finally understood. She didn't have to preserve every object to preserve her love. That lesson had taken years to learn. Lisa walked slowly around the room. Her fingers brushed across the bookshelf. She smiled at familiar titles. Stories read hundreds of times. Bedtime routines she could almost recite from memory. The memories remained vivid. Nothing could take them away. The realization brought comfort, not sadness, comfort. She moved toward the toy cars. The same cars she had carefully arranged week after week, month after month, year after year. A small laugh escaped her. The memory arrived immediately. Tiny hands insisting every car face exactly the right direction. Tiny arguments about which one was fastest. Tiny victories celebrated with enormous enthusiasm. For the first time in a very long while, Lisa noticed something. The memory arrived before the pain. The smile arrived before the tears. That mattered. It mattered more than she could explain. A few days later, she invited Brian to her house, not because she needed help, because she wanted him to see something. When Brian arrived, he immediately sensed a difference. Not in the house, in Lisa. The heaviness she had carried for years hadn't disappeared, but it no longer seemed to define every corner of her life. She looked lighter, more present, more hopeful. They talked for a while in the living room before Lisa finally stood. "Come on." Brian followed her down the hallway. The familiar hallway. The hallway that had changed his life months earlier. As they approached the bedroom, Brian felt the same emotions returning. The same respect. The same tenderness. The same awareness that this room represented something sacred. Lisa opened the door. Brian looked inside. For a moment he simply stood there. The room remained recognizable. The bed remained. The bookshelf remained. The photographs remained. The memories remained. Yet something had changed. Subtly, respectfully. The room no longer felt frozen. It felt honored, alive, a place of remembrance, instead of a place suspended in time. Lisa walked inside. Brian followed quietly. She picked up a framed photograph from the dresser, smiled, then placed it carefully on a shelf, designed to display favorite memories. Nearby sat several treasured items: the hospital bracelets, the handwritten cards, special drawings, pieces of a life deeply loved, not hidden, not forgotten, celebrated. Brian watched her. The process moved him more than he expected, because he understood what it represented. Courage, the kind people rarely talk about. The courage to remember without becoming trapped. The courage to love without fear of pain. The courage to keep living. Lisa looked around the room, then smiled. "It feels different." Brian nodded. "How?" She considered the question, then answered honestly. "It feels like a memory now." A pause, not a wound. Brian swallowed hard. The words stayed with him, because they carried truth, not only for Lisa, for him too. Over the following weeks, life continued moving forward. The friendship between Brian and Lisa continued growing, naturally, patiently. Neither rushed anything, neither forced anything. The foundation had already been built. Trust, respect, understanding. Those things came first. Everything else followed. Their conversations became more frequent, then longer. then more personal. Sometimes they met for lunch. Sometimes they spent time talking after work. Sometimes they simply walked and talked without any destination in mind. Neither pretended not to enjoy it. The connection had become too obvious for that. Yet, what made it meaningful wasn't excitement. It was comfort. Being around one another felt easy, safe, genuine. Months earlier, both of them had been hiding from life. Now both found themselves participating in it again. One evening, after spending hours talking about everything and nothing, Brian found himself smiling during the drive home. The realization arrived unexpectedly. He hadn't thought about work once. Not once. That had never happened before. He laughed quietly, then shook his head. Years spent chasing success. Years spent believing achievement would bring fulfillment. And somehow the thing that made him happiest was a conversation. The simplicity of that truth amazed him. Meanwhile, Lisa experienced her own realization. One Saturday afternoon, she caught herself planning something she hadn't planned in years. The future. Not next week. Not next month. The future. Dreams. Possibilities. Experiences she wanted to have. Places she wanted to visit. Moments she wanted to create. For years, imagining the future felt impossible. Now it felt exciting. That change mattered. Eventually, the conversation neither of them expected finally arrived. Not dramatic, not theatrical, not filled with speeches. Just honest. One evening, after another long conversation, Brian looked at Lisa and smiled. "I have a question." Lisa immediately laughed. "That sounds dangerous." "It isn't. That's exactly what people say before asking dangerous questions." Brian shook his head, then laughed. The familiar exchange eased the nerves both of them felt. Finally, he spoke. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" Lisa looked at him. For a second, neither moved. Neither looked away. The moment felt surprisingly calm. Not shocking, not overwhelming, almost inevitable. Because the relationship had been heading toward this point for a long time. Built on friendship. Built on trust. Built on understanding. Lisa smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that reached her eyes. "I'd like that." Brian smiled too. And just like that, a new chapter began. Not because someone rescued the other. Not because either person completed the other. Because both had already begun healing. Both had already begun living. The relationship grew naturally from there. Patiently. Respectfully. The same way everything important between them had grown. Time passed. Seasons changed. Life continued. And eventually another community gathering arrived. The event felt familiar. Families filled the area. Music floated through the evening air. Neighbors greeted one another. Children laughed and played. Food covered long tables. The entire community seemed alive with energy. This time, however, something was different. Brian wasn't standing on the edge of the gathering checking his watch. He wasn't planning an early exit. He wasn't thinking about reports waiting on his desk. He was present. Completely present, for perhaps the first time in years. As the evening unfolded, Brian looked around at the people surrounding him. Employees, friends, families, neighbors, people sharing stories, people creating memories, people living. A realization settled over him. Success had never been the company. Success had never been the money. Success had never been the awards or growth charts or profit margins. Those things mattered, but they weren't enough. Success looked like connection. Success looked like community. Success looked like relationships. Success looked like standing beside people who genuinely mattered. For years he had searched for fulfillment in achievement. Now he finally understood where it had been hiding all along. Nearby, Lisa watched families enjoying the evening. Music drifted through the crowd. Laughter echoed across the gathering. And for the first time since losing her son, she experienced something she once thought impossible. Joy, not survival, not temporary distraction. Joy, real joy. The emotion caught her by surprise. Not because it existed, because it arrived, without guilt. For years, every happy moment carried questions. Should I feel this way? Am I moving on too quickly? Am I forgetting? Tonight those questions were gone. She finally understood something important. Healing had never required forgetting. Love remained. Memories remained. Nothing precious had disappeared. The difference was simple. Life had room for both remembrance and happiness. Standing there beneath the Montana sky, Lisa felt hope. Not the fragile hope of someone barely holding on. The steady hope of someone ready to embrace the future. Brian glanced toward her. Lisa looked back. Both smiled. No words necessary. The journey had changed both of them. The lonely millionaire who measured life through numbers. The grieving mother who measured life through loss. Both had discovered something greater. Connection, purpose, healing, love. The music continued. Families continued laughing. Neighbors continued sharing stories. Life continued moving forward. And this time, Brian and Lisa moved forward with it. Together. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to Mr. George Stories. Your support helps these stories reach more people who may need encouragement, hope, and a reminder that healing is possible. And remember, you never truly know what someone else is carrying. Grief does not disappear, but healing is possible. Success means very little without meaningful human connection. Real love grows through understanding and respect. The most important moments in life are often the quietest ones. And sometimes, helping someone heal becomes the very thing that helps you heal too.